Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and we're holding our biennial conference of election analysis, an election day roundup. We've been doing this for quite some time, and as a matter of amazing fact, this is the 13th such encounter. Tonight's program will be that we'll have first something from our three speakers, and then question period until around 6:15, and then there will be a supper served outside for an hour, and then we'll return here around 7:15 for another hour of discussion and questions. We've always had these two speakers, Bill Galston and Bill Kristol, the Democrat and the Republican, but it's unusual this time because we have no speaker on behalf of Donald Trump, the actual winner.
Don't count on it.
But I nonetheless declare this an unsafe space. You might hear something you disagree with, and we'll hope that we have disagreement with our two speakers. Now, we've also added, here's another thing new, we've added Susan Schell, who's here to discuss America's first woman president.
Needless to say, I'll be brief.
So I'll introduce her first. I'm going to be very brief on this. Susan Schell is chair of the political science department at Boston College. She's a scholar of Kant, has written 2-3 books on Immanuel Kant. She's a graduate of Cornell and got her PhD at Harvard. Then we have William Galston, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He's a graduate of Cornell and a PhD from Chicago. I'd like to add this. And he also has written a book on Kant, his first book. So as someone said, we've got two Kantians on our panel tonight. And he's also, I think, a major contributor to the theory of liberalism. And he writes on policy studies as well. He was in the White House in the first Clinton administration. And then Bill Kristol, who's the editor and publisher of the Weekly Standard, who's went to Harvard both times, got his PhD in the government department, like Susan. He began his career in academia, but then quickly moved to Washington, where he was an assistant to William Bennett in the Reagan administration, and to Dan Quayle in the Bush administration, and since then he has undertaken Republican Party initiatives, and finally now, for the past 2 decades, editor and publisher, as I said, of the Weekly Standard. So we'll start first with statements from our three speakers, and we'll begin with Bill Galston.
Well timed. That was
planned this. I was almost saved by the bell, but not quite. Look, this is an opening statement, and I've always found that the most valuable part of this session is the vigorous Q&A after the opening statements. So I will be as brief as possible, consistent with the division of labor that I worked out with Bill Kristol. I really want to do 2 things. Thing number 1 is to review just a little bit of data with you, bearing not so much on the outcome of the election as the sorts of cleavages in the electorate that the election revealed. You've heard a lot about the impact of education, particularly on the white vote. And it turned out that the pre-election prognosticators who are focusing on that were not misguided, however wrong they may have gotten the outcome. Hillary Clinton did better among white voters with a college education than any Democrat has done in many decades. She almost fought Donald Trump to a draw. It was 45% for her, 49% for Mr. Trump. On the flip side, she did worse than any Democrat in living memory, and perhaps ever, among whites without college educations. She received only 28% of that group compared to 67% for Donald Trump. That figure in and of itself is almost the silver bullet explanation as to what happened in Pennsylvania and the upper Midwest. You've also heard a fair amount about gender. That too mattered. And here's a remarkable comparison for you. Take whites with college degrees, BAs or more, and divide them into two familiar groups, men and women. Among white college-educated women, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump 51-45. Among white college-educated men, she lost to Mr. Trump by 15 percentage points, 39-54. So that's almost a laboratory test of when you overlay gender on education, what kind of pattern do you see? And it's obvious that holding education constant, women were much more drawn to Hillary Clinton, men to Donald Trump. What about ideology? I would not describe Mr. Trump as a moderate man, but he did pretty well among moderate voters. A good rule of thumb is that a Democratic candidate for president is safe if he or she wins upwards of 60% of the moderate vote. And by contrast, if that number sinks to the low 50s, the Democrat is in serious trouble. And in fact, Hillary Clinton only got 52% of the moderate vote compared to 41% for Mr. Trump. Clearly, despite his immoderate tone, many voters came away with the impression that the substance of his policies would not be either familiar liberalism or hard-edged conservatism. And they will probably turn out to be right about that, at least in some respects. You may also have heard about religion. And here there were some very, very familiar gaps. For example, people of no religion, unaffiliated voters, went for Hillary Clinton by almost 70%. There was a lot of speculation about a split in the evangelical community as a result of Mr. Trump's less than total fidelity to elements of the Christian teaching. But in fact, as far as I can tell from the exit polls, he paid no discernible price. He received fully 81% of the evangelical Christian vote. The white evangelical Christian vote, I should say. And similarly, there was a lot of speculation about Trump's candidacy leading to some sort of split within the Republican Party or fall off of Republican support for him. There is zero evidence that that happened. In fact, he did slightly better among Republicans than Hillary Clinton did among Democrats. What mattered to voters? Well, Hillary Clinton did very well among voters who gave pride of place to someone who, quote, cares about me, someone with the right experience, someone with the right temperament. But the single biggest block in the electorate gave pride of place to a candidate who could, quote, bring about change. And that is where Mr. Trump won the election, because 83% of the people who gave change top billing voted for Donald Trump and only 16% for Hillary Clinton. You know, in an odd way, Donald Trump's campaign was the mirror image of Barack Obama's campaign in 2008. You know, a promise of change, details to come. And it remains to be seen whether people who were willing to take a flyer on Mr. Trump will be as pleased as they are today after they unwrap their Christmas presents. Stay tuned. Now, what about two of the hot button issues that dominated the campaign? What do the American people think about them? What about illegal immigrants? Mr. Trump, I think, had a lot to do with putting that issue on the agenda. Well, it turns out that 70% of Americans in this election believe that illegal immigrants working in the United States should be offered legal status, 7-0. And only, by contrast, only 25% think that they ought to be deported back to Mexico or Central America or the Middle East or wherever. By contrast, a plurality of Americans agree with the proposition that international trade takes away U.S. jobs. And if I were to identify the silver bullet issue that tipped the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin towards, into the Trump column, it would not be immigration. It would be trade. And so you put these, you put the demography and the issues together. Trump's victory rested on white working class voters who were principally worried about the impact of international trade on their jobs, on their communities. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Anna. There is an enormous amount of other revealing information in the exit polls, but those were some of the highlights I wanted to bring out for you. But it seems to me my real value added in this opening statement is not so much reading exit polls, which the diligent or masochistic among you can do for themselves. It is rather trying to frame the significance of this election. And in retrospect, this was the clue. After the Brexit vote, oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, I see. Yes, this is being taped for posterity. I actually think it looks better if this bottle, impedes the view of my face. But what can I say? I stayed up most of the night and into the early morning hours listening to the BBC in the hours after the Brexit vote. And after about 10 minutes, something dawned on me. Change the proper nouns, change the accent. They could have been talking about the U.S. presidential election. And the more I thought about it, and then when I looked at the actual outcome of the election, it occurred to me that this election was anything but an example of American exceptionalism. Anything but. In fact, and if I have an analytical contribution, you're about to hear it, the United States now has joined what I think of as the fourth great convergence of politics among the Western democracies since the end of the Second World War. And let me rattle them off very quickly. All the nations I've just described, in one way or another, spent the first 3 decades after the Second World War creating and or fortifying the programs of social protection that we have come to know as the welfare state. They also spent those 3 decades enjoying an unprecedented period of economic growth, which is why the French refer to those 3 decades as the 30 glorious years. But in many ways, I think most Americans feel about the same about the 25 or 30 years after the Second World War. We had a few assassinations and a failed war to disrupt our sense of tranquility, but still, I think most Americans felt pretty good about those 3 decades. As you know, throughout the West, the good times came to a screeching halt in the mid and late 1970s for all sorts of reasons, giving rise to a conservative renewal that manifested itself in the rise of Margaret Thatcher to the leading position in the UK, the rise of Ronald Reagan to the leadership of the United States, the rise of John Paul II to the leadership of the Catholic Church, and a number of other notable conservative, but fresh conservative thinkers and actors of the period. In response, there was a third great period of convergence, which featured the renewal on the center left. And there you had figures like Bill Clinton, Tony Blair in the UK, a much underrated Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, who was actually an economic reformer who laid the foundation for the superior competitiveness that Germany has displayed in the past 2 decades. There was a period of confusion, I think sparked by the dissenting reactions to the decision of George W. Bush to go to war in Iraq. I'm not pronouncing judgment on that decision, merely noting that it was intensely controversial at home and abroad. And then, of course, the impact, which really has not ended, of the end of the modest recovery at the end of 2007 and the beginning of the Great Recession, which took a big bite out of the economies of the Western democracies, some of which have recovered, many of which have not. Those events have led to the fourth great conversion, which is a populist revolt against the leadership of center-left and center-right parties throughout Western Europe, the UK, and the United States. In my judgment, all of these populist eruptions revolve around some version of 3 fundamental issues. First, on the economy, the reaction, varying reactions, I would say, to the impact of globalization and technological change on the structure of the workforce and work opportunities. In society, demographic change, much of which sparked by population movements, some legal, some illegal. But throughout Europe, the UK, and the United States, the sense of disruption, of the loss of a familiar balance in the society because of demographic change, has had a major political impact. If you look back to 1965, the United States adopted 2 momentous pieces of legislation during that period. One of them, the Voting Rights Act, hit American politics like a grenade thrown into a foxhole. The other the Immigration Reform Bill of 1965, which reopened the gates of immigration after 41 years in which they had slammed shut, not only increased the pace of immigration on an annual basis, but also opened it up to countries and entire continents that had been conspicuous by their near absence in previous waves of immigration. During the first, or should I say second Great Wave, in, say, the 40 years between 1880 and 1920, the share of foreign-born Americans tripled from 5 to 15%, and it was at that point that some sort of threshold had been reached, and a nativist reaction set in, and the 1924 restrictionist immigration law was the consequence of that. Well, as a result of that law, by the mid-1960s, when immigration reform was adopted in the United States, the share of foreign-born members of the U.S. population had sunk all the way back down to 4.7%. We opened the doors, and now, as we speak, it stands at 14%, almost exactly where it stood at the time, at the time of a big reaction. I don't think the reaction is nearly as comprehensive as it was in the 1920s, and I'm not convinced that the reaction will be as disproportionate as it was in the mid-1920s, but it is no accident, comrades, that we are having this discussion right about now. And the third major issue, I've talked about the economy, I've talked about society and demographic change, but there's a third issue, and that is the quest for sovereignty, regaining national sovereignty in one way or another. And Donald Trump crystallized it when he talked about globalism versus nationalism. In one way or another, all the populist movements are seeking to reassert national sovereignty against international arrangements and international institutions. In the UK, it was a revolt against the EU. In the case of Donald Trump, it is remarkably, and perhaps Bill Kristol will say something about this, a revolt against the international institutions, diplomatic and military, that the United States took the lead in creating in the second 7 decades, the 7 decades after the Second World War. America First, even if you sort out its awkward historical resonance, is really a reassertion of the power of a single country, one's own country, to act with many fewer fetters than the dissenting citizens and populist movements now experience. For them, internationalism is not empowering, it is disempowering. And they seek to regain power by disempowering the institutions that they see as almost like the invisible cords that bound Gulliver. So, how does this all sort out? It has created, and I tried to sketch in my opening remarks, it has created fundamental differences of opinion and demographic cleavages based on differing outlooks and differing interests. So, obviously, it separates the winners from globalization from the losers at the hands of globalization. So, information, finance, the professions versus the industrial sector, the mining sector, et cetera, et cetera. It divides those with an internationalist outlook and interests correspondingly from those who see the world through the prism of nationalism. It divides, as we've already seen, the highly educated from the less educated. It divides younger citizens and older citizens. It divides the centers, the big cities, from smaller towns in remote locations and also rural areas. It divides those who celebrate heterogeneity versus those who are threatened by heterogeneity. It separates those who are empowered, feel empowered by these changes, and those who feel disempowered. And perhaps, and perhaps most significantly, it divides those who experience their lives as in the ascendancy from those who experience their lives as a process of decline. I'll end by referring briefly to a piece of survey research which I helped design, which was published just 3 weeks ago, and some of the findings, some of the findings are truly remarkable. Let me just give you a handful. Since the 1950s, do you think that American culture and way of life has mostly changed for the better or mostly for the worse? 56% of Americans with a college education think it has changed for the better. 65% of those without a college education think it has changed for the worse. Another question: are America's best days ahead of us or behind us? 57% of college-educated Americans say our best days are ahead of us. 61% of Americans without a college education say that our best days are behind us. And if you look at questions that zero in on the determinants of hope of future versus fear of the future, you will see exactly the same alignment. In many ways, the election was a choice between what the United States used to be half a century ago and what it will be a half a century from now. It was a debate between a promise to restore the past, on the one hand, make America great again, and make it great again in the same way that it was great back then, with lots of brawny industrial jobs paying family wages to men, as opposed to the country that the United States will become inevitably. I focused on education, so let me finish with an education factoid. 3 decades ago, the number of whites without a college education exceeded the number of whites with a college education by a ratio of 2 to 1, and that manifested itself in the electorate. This year, for the first time ever, the share of the electorate constituted by whites with college education, 37%, exceeded the share without a college education, 34%, the first time ever. Those two lines crossed between 2012 and 2016, and they are not crossing back. And so what happened this year represented a record surge of white voters without a college education into the electorate. But in the long run, they do not represent the future of the country or the future of American politics. But as Mr. Keynes reminded us, in the long run, we are all dead. Thank you very much.
On that cheerful note, I can certainly pick up. It's good to be here again, and I was pretty depressed late Tuesday night. I cheered up a little bit Wednesday morning just because why not, and I'm a cheerful guy. But really, my spirits are fully restored by coming to Harvard, coming to Cambridge last night, and then hanging out, getting coffee early this morning at one of the fashionable cafes in Harvard Square, and overhearing all the snippets of conversations around me. And there's nothing like, ridiculously self-pitying and unself-aware Cambridge liberals having deeply meaningful conversations with each other at 7:15 a.m. to really cheer up someone like me. So I want to thank Cambridge and Harvard for restoring me temporarily to good spirits. Then I'll go back to Washington and confront the actual consequences of what happened, and that's maybe a different story. Let me make 7 points, I guess, somewhat not randomly, but on different aspects of the election and its consequences. Bill did a great job of presenting the basic facts, demographic, and other facts of the election. So I'll just really add a couple of footnotes to what he said. I got a lot of things wrong, as many people did this year, in predicting what would happen, especially in the Republican primaries. I think the one thing I did see was that being on the side of change when the electorate is in a mood of change is really good in politics. And you can be a pretty flawed candidate, and people, like many people in this room probably, could think that it's the flaws, and I thought this too, are sufficient enough to disqualify you. But when people, for whatever reason, good or bad, and one of the odd footnotes of this election is you had an electorate that really wanted to shake things up, not in the middle of the Great Depression, not when we're in the middle of a losing war, the world's a mess, and people like me would argue that it's a mess because we're probably not doing enough to prevent it from being a mess, and the economy could be growing faster, and these working class wages are not growing and all that. Still, at the end of the day, if you came down in the big sweep of history, or in the big sweep even of the world, as it is now, and looked at the American economy, and to some degree American society, that's probably more complicated. I don't think you would say it's in just horrible shape. You understand why you get a Huey Long and a Father Coughlin and all that in 1935. It's a little mysterious why you get a Donald Trump in 2016, and it's worth thinking about. But whatever the deep or non-deep reasons for that, the mood of change can be real. And I really took that from being in the first Bush White House when I was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff. In 92, I remember this here, I sort of had the instinct, I wasn't very experienced in politics, but I had the instinct in late 91, early 92, that the Bush White House, the George H.W. Bush White House, was very overconfident about their prospects and that people wanted change. It had been 12 years, 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush. They were also thrilled when Mario Cuomo didn't run and other big shot Democrats, and we had an unknown, obscure governor of Arkansas. I said, I don't know, maybe that would be tougher to beat someone younger and less identified with politics of the past and all that, and liberalism of the past. Anyway, what I learned in Bush's share of the vote from 88 to George H.W. Bush was not a terrible president. The country was not in terrible shape in 1992. We won the Cold War without firing a shot. We had a little recession, and we're coming back out of it. George H.W. Bush's share of the vote in 4 years went from 54% to 38%. It's really one of the biggest declines ever in 4 years for a party in power. It's like Hoover, from 28 to 32, but that's a little more explicable, And that taught me a lesson, that when people are in the mood for change, rational or somewhat irrational, psychological or sociological or whatever, it's hard to stand up against it. I saw that coming a little bit in 92, and I did see that a little bit this year, and I said many times that, if Trump were going to win, it was going to be because the desire for change overwhelmed the hesitations about Trump personally. And he did a pretty good job. I mean, every time he became the issue, his numbers went down. People decided, oh my God, you can't put him in the White House. Every time he was able to keep himself out of the news to some degree and just be the kind of, not generic change candidate because he's so unusual, but a generically populist, I guess you'd say, change candidate, and tone down the personal attacks and the attacks on Gold Star parents and the sort of craziness for a little while, or stuff didn't come out about his past for a little while, he gained in the polls. And he got lucky at the end and gained, to some degree, and gained right at the end. He saw this, I got to say. And the one time I thought he might win, the time I most thought he might win was right after the Republican convention, before the Democratic convention, and Khan getting in the fight with the Khan family, which really hurt him badly. But before that, he had not a great Republican convention, but an adequate one. But the one thing I thought he did very well was he said Hillary Clinton's slogan, is I'm with her, and my slogan is I'm with you. And Trump did a pretty good job by the end of convincing just enough, and really just enough when you look at the numbers, voters in 3 key states basically, that he was with them despite his flaws, and that the Hillary Clinton campaign was about her, and the Donald Trump campaign, I mean, whatever the truth of this, is kind of amazing that he pulled this off, but nonetheless, that the Donald Trump campaign was about them. So that was change just can sometimes take this momentum of its own. As Bill said, there's sort of an international version of this going on, which probably played into this as well. But certainly in the U.S. context, I think that was Trump's great. That's what took him to the just past the finish line. We'll overinterpret, of course, all these elections because they turn on some tiny percentage of the vote, and then we're going to make a huge, if Clinton had won by 0.5%, 14,000 votes had changed in Michigan and 50,000 in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin would all be, giving deep explanations of why it was inevitable that Hillary Clinton would win. But that's another story about social science, and I'll come back to that actually because it's an interesting point. But Trump won, so it's worth trying to explain it. One footnote for Bill's class or education, which I think is now a pretty good proxy for class, split in counties that, if you divide the country into counties that have a Cracker Barrel restaurant and counties that have a Whole Foods store. Trump, let's see if I can get this right. The gap, in 1992, they began doing this. I guess both organizations were going strong. And Clinton did better by 19% won 19% more of the Whole Foods counties than the Cracker Barrel counties. The Bush won 19% more of the Cracker Barrel than Whole Foods. In 2016, Trump won 76% of Cracker Barrel counties, 22% of Whole Foods counties. So that sort of encapsulates the class, socioeconomic difference that's out there. Having said that, my only caveat to this is Trump did win college-educated white voters. People are I was on TV Tuesday night, and of course everyone goes for understandably, the headline was white working class, massive, massive margins. But he did win. He didn't just do okay. He won with college-educated, and he wouldn't have won the election if he hadn't won college-educated. That is, it's arbitrary which 1 or 2% you decide is the key 1 or 2%, but as an actual empirical fact, it's nice that he ran up these massive margins in rural areas and did surprisingly well in working class areas, but he had to hold his own in white suburban areas. In McLean, Virginia, where I live, and some people in this room undoubtedly are familiar with it, so it's probably like Belmont around here or Lexington or something, upper middle class suburb, Virginia side, so a little more conservative than the Maryland suburbs. My precinct, we went for our incumbent, it's a swing district, our incumbent Congresswoman, Barbara Comstock, won at about, I won't bore you with the numbers, won at about 55-45. It's a 50-50 district. She's an incumbent, she's a good candidate, she won the district as a whole, 54-46. So, Hillary Clinton won our precinct by, I think, 614 votes to 429. But 429 out of 1,000 isn't nothing, Trump got 40% of those votes. And that's the same is true if you look at the Oakland County suburbs of Detroit and at Waukesha in Wisconsin and at the Philadelphia. Trump held his own in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He lost Montgomery County, which is the sort of inner Philadelphia suburbs. He lost that about 60-40, 50-50 in Bucks County, and he needed those numbers to win Pennsylvania. Now, he won rural counties 80-20, he won working class areas, coal towns 70-30, so I don't want to minimize the class and educational split. But he did a little better among white college-educated voters than people realize. He did a little better than Romney did among non-white voters, which is kind of amazing. But they vote class and opinion and attitude as just like white voters do, and they don't entirely vote as an ethnic bloc, and they don't entirely vote on issues that liberal elites decide are the issues they should vote on. And they're more diverse, those communities, especially Hispanics, than people sort of understand sometimes, more different subgroups. So Trump did, again, just well enough in those groups not to lose. Hillary Clinton also underperformed badly with African Americans, and that's the major contrast when you look at the numbers compared to 2008 or 2012. I guess there's a lot of votes still to come in. We have a slightly weird federalist system here, so California's just decided if it's not close, they're not going to bother counting absentee ballots, for a week, So there are literally, 1.5 million votes or something left in California to be counted, and another couple of million elsewhere in the country. When all the votes come in, I think Trump will end up with almost exactly the same vote as Romney had in terms of numbers. And Bill can correct me, he's probably looked at this more closely, and not that many more than McCain. Hillary Clinton's vote compared to Obama in 2008, 2012 dropped off. So for all the rhetoric about this amazing Trump showing and all that, he lost the popular vote by about what will end up being about 1.3, 1.4%, and he got basically the same number of votes as Romney or McCain. He got a higher distribution of working class votes than they did, and a somewhat lower percentage of college-educated and upper-middle-class votes. But again, not a tiny percentage of those votes. That's why he was able to win. Okay, that's first point, just on the returns. Second, on the consequences. Let me talk about the Republicans for a minute, then the Democrats. Republicans, I think who knows, we haven't really had, this is a very unusual moment, Trump was a very unusual candidate in so many ways, but just in the most obvious way. We haven't elected anyone without prior experience in elective office since Eisenhower in '52. He had a lot of government experience, though, and was pretty predictable, I think you could say, in terms of what kind of president he would be. Before that, you have to go back to, Hoover, who'd been a cabinet secretary, and before that, I think you're back into the 19th century in terms of people who hadn't held elective office, and the only other people, in fact, are generals in the military. So who knows? It's very hard to predict a Trump presidency in general. It's very hard to predict someone like him who has no history in the Republican Party about what effect he will have on the party, or what effect the party will have on him. And I think you can have a huge range of scenarios, and of course a lot of events will matter a lot. Is he successful? Is the economy good? Is the economy bad? Does he make horrible mistakes in foreign policy? Does he not? But I would say that one way to put the question, just to think about it, is, some reporter called me yesterday and said, what does it feel like, you were never Trump, what does it feel like to be in Trump's party? And I think that's a good way of putting the question, and the question I ask back is, well, is it Trump's party? And it's a question. On the one hand, if you win a presidential election, even if you win it by a very narrow margin and lose the popular vote, even if you trail Republican candidates for the Senate and the House in many cases, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but I think he trailed the generic Republican ballot, because if you think about most states, at least he helped Republican senators. He ran ahead of Republican senators in some states, but he ran behind Republican senators in more states off the top of my head that I can think of, and then ahead. Certainly in many House districts like mine, he ran behind a winning House member. So it's not like Reagan in 1980, where he dragged 10 new Republican senators across the finish line. So in some respects, it's the same Republican Party. It really is. 52 senators instead of 54, 200 and whatever it's going to turn out to be, 38 or something House members instead of 245. The huge majority of them is the actual same people. 32 Republican governors, huge majority of them the same ones as were governor 4 days ago. 2/3 of the state legislative chambers. It just happens there's a new president on top of this pyramid. But presidents matter a lot, obviously. I don't think he has mattered as much so far as one might have thought. I don't think a lot of Republican House members or senators, certainly not incumbents, but even challengers, they didn't run particularly as Trump Republicans. I would say that's again different from 1980. My former boss, Dan Quayle, when he ran as a young challenger against Birch Bayh in Indiana, ran as a Reagan Republican. He was going to go with Reagan to Washington and shake it up. Most of the Republicans this year just ran as basically what Republicans have run as in previous years. Maybe a little bit of a Trump twist on trade. They weren't getting way out there and being for the TPP, the Asian trade agreement. Maybe a little bit on immigration. They certainly weren't highlighting the fact that they might have voted for the Gang of Eight bill, but they didn't sound like Trump exactly on immigration. Most other issues, I think, pretty normal, conventional Republican policies. But again, he is now going to be president. If Trump had lost, I think there was quite a good chance that Trump's effect on the Republican Party would have been limited. There would have been civil wars, there would have been a Trump faction, there would have been a lot happening, but I think at the end of the day, it would have been a reasonable prediction that the 2018 Republican Party and the 2020 Republican Party would look more like Paul Ryan or I mean, you pick it, Joni Ernst or Ben Sass or Tom Cotton or, various governors around, John Kasich or Rick Scott or anyone like, than Donald Trump. I don't know that that's the case now, because presidents do matter, and he will have an agenda. He'll work it out with Congress. He may not get, maybe some of it he'll defer to Congress. But being an actual president who has won, especially in a surprise and an upset election, with so much of the establishment, obviously, including so much of the Republican establishment against him, he has a lot of power right now, I think, or a lot of momentum, or a lot of potential power, I guess. Very hard to know how that plays out, I think. And of course, a huge amount depends on his own political skills. A huge amount depends on events that happen in the world. If I were advising him, which he hasn't called me to ask yet for some reason, I mean, he needs to win some early fights. He needs to figure out what issues he can get pretty united Republican support on, and some Democrats on, and there are some, obviously. Get that stuff through Congress and really build up his clout. If he starts picking fights very early on, I think, with the majorities, you could get a situation where the sort of 2/3 of the Republican Party just decides we just have to sort of live with this guy and contain him and minimize sort of his clout and for the next 4 years. If he, having come off this electoral victory, sort of governs in a way that builds up his standing, his momentum, that's a very different story. So for me, this is, it's a very interesting open question. Trade is the one issue, I would say, where has changed the party some. And of course, Sanders has changed the Democratic Party. So we did have, candidates matter even before they become president. This year, I believe this is true, in all the preceding elections, I mean, back to, 1948, I believe, both candidates of both parties have basically been for free trade, and whatever pending free trade agreement or dispute was in play, both candidates supported the agreement, whether it was NAFTA in 92 or 96, or TPP in 2012. Obama and Romney were for it. I don't think it had been quite signed yet, so it wasn't finalized, though it was pretty close. This is the first time when both candidates, in Hillary Clinton's case nominally, in Donald Trump's case centrally to his campaign, were against it. Depending on what you think about trade and how important it is, and how important it is to the American world order that it was a part of over the last 70 years, and depending how beneficial or not you think that order is, that's a pretty big deal, I would say. That's, I think, the one consequence I sort of see so far. The others we're going to have to see as he governs. So I think it's a big question. Is it Trump's party? Is it Trump's party 2 years from now? Is the Republican Party Trump's party 2 years from now? Is it 4 years from now? I mean, if it really is Trump's party 4 years from now, and Trump hasn't totally changed and just become an ordinary Republican, that's a pretty big change in American politics. Third, the Democrats. I won't dwell on this except to make the obvious point that, I mean, on the one hand, the Democrats do have a winning presidential coalition. They will have won the popular vote 6 of the last 7 elections. They lost 2 of them in the Electoral College. At the presidential level, I think a different candidate and a whole bunch of different events would have given them a victory this time too, so they don't need to panic. On the other hand, I believe it's correct that the Democrats, in terms of offices held around the country, are at their lowest point since before the Great Depression. I mean, think about it. They're in a minority. They don't know the presidency. They're in a minority in both houses of Congress, and they're not so likely to get the Senate back to win the Senate in 2018, even though an off-year election should be good for them because they have so many Democratic Senate seats up. They hold, I think, 18 out of 50 governorships and about 1/3 of the state legislative chambers. Not a party that's in great shape. And Bernie Sanders was the main opponent to Hillary Clinton. He's not presumably going to run again. He's pretty old. A lot of their leadership is quite elderly. Not so obvious that they have a huge number of rising stars. People could rise very fast, of course. Barack Obama at this point in 2004 was 2 days, was a senator-elect for 2 days, from Illinois. So people can move very quickly up the ladder. But right now, I do think the Democrats have a challenge. And I think one implication of Hillary Clinton's defeat will be, I assume, but I defer to Bill on this, to move the Democrats to the left, or at least to embolden the left to say, if we had not nominated the one Democratic candidate who was out there, who was given a zillion speeches to Goldman Sachs, who was on record in favor of all these trade deals in the past, who has made tens of millions of dollars when she was out of government, who's been part of government directly or indirectly for 20 years in Washington, we would have won. Maybe a correct analysis, maybe not, but I think that will have a lot of force in the Democratic Party. So interesting to see who the Democrats. I mean, 2017 and 2018 become very important years, I think, for the future, the nature and future of American politics. What kind of candidates get nominated in each party? There will be big primaries, I think, on both sides. There'll be, people looking at Trump and saying, hey, I could do that too at the state level. In Virginia, where I live, Ed Gillespie, as everyone's assumed, he almost won the Senate seat against Tim Kaine in 2014. Everyone's assumed he's the governor's gubernatorial nominee in 2017, and all things equal, very good chance to win. I don't know, he's going to get a primary challenge from he would have gotten a primary challenge anyway from a Tea Party type. He would have won that, I think. Now if he gets a more Trumpite primary challenge, who knows? And then, of course, 2018, there'll be a ton of House and Senate primaries, races, which could have primaries. A lot depends on Trump. Does he support incumbents like a traditional president does with respect to members of his own party? Or does he take them on? And that's happened before in American history, right? Franklin Roosevelt in 38 and occasionally. And on the Democratic side, you could have an awful lot, I think, of turmoil and turnover in the next couple of cycles. So both parties, I think, very much, it's an open question how much they retain their current character, for better or worse. Let me step back for a minute and make a comment on the election as a whole. And this is, I'll put it this way. If you came down from Mars about 4 months ago and looked, and someone said, hey, here's an election going on, and this was, let's say, after Trump clinched it, but before Clinton did, there are 3 candidates left standing. There's an authoritarian populist demagogue on the right, very rich guy, celebrity. He's capitalizing on people's anxieties and grievances. He's going to be the nominee of one party. There's a socialist, democratic socialist, who hasn't really changed his views about anything in 40, 50 years. And I mean, again, I'm not saying this pejoratively. I just think that's basically correct. And same with Trump. It's just an analytical statement, fact value distinction and all that. And there's Sanders, the socialist, who's running us free college tuition and inequality and the usual and so forth. And then there's an insider candidate, kind of her husband's been president. The family did very well out of their public service. Personally, they have the daughter's part of the foundation, which has murky relationships with the State Department while she's Secretary of State. Again, whatever the merits of all these details, but let's say that image, a total insider candidate. If you came down and they said, okay, where is this election happening? You would say Argentina, right? And again, I'm just saying this analytically. I mean, isn't this what third world elections look like? I mean, a socialist, an authoritarian populist, sort of nativist right-winger, and an insider, semi-corrupt, sometimes competent, but nonetheless kind of, not in touch with regular people type elitist candidate. That's what this election, and I think that's worrisome. I mean, maybe that's an unfair characterization, but I think there's some truth to it. I mean, think of it this way. I think it was Marty Lipset, the sociologist, political scientist, who brought to public awareness in social science the term American exceptionalism. I mean, it's become a political term now, but it was originally, I believe, there are people in this room who know much more about this than I do, so I'll say this all, I could be corrected on this, but this was a social science term, not a political term, American exceptionalism. And what was exceptional about America? What was exceptional about America, and I think this comes from Werner Sombart, if I'm not mistaken, the German sociologist way back when. What was exceptional about America was America had no big socialist movement. I mean, it had socialists, it had a little socialist party, it had socialist-tinged trade unionists, but it did not have a massive social democratic movement, to say nothing of a communist movement, as Germany had, and as Britain had, and as the other advanced industrialized countries had in the first part of the 20th century. That's what the American exceptionalism was. The question was the answer to the question why is America different, and the answer had to do with various sociological and economic and cultural factors that various historians and sociologists and political scientists examined. The flip side of that, and I don't know how explicitly this was part of American exceptionalism, but I think it was sort of understood to be, the flip side of that was America also didn't have too much of right-wing demagogic authoritarianism. Again, we had it, but we had it at the level of Governor, of a Huey Long, or Father Coughlin, or Joe McCarthy. We had it at the level of senators and governors, neither major party ever nominated someone who you could fairly call, I think, that type of nationalist, authoritarian, populist type. And on the liberal side, the Democratic Party pretty consistently pushed aside the Henry Wallaces and, I guess George McGovern, I suppose, is the most liberal nominee, Barack Obama, but they tried pretty hard, and Obama certainly tried very hard to show that he was more in the liberal American tradition than in some sort of socialist tradition, and I think he really was in most ways. So that was kind of what American exceptionalism was. Now, it frustrated a lot of people, kind of boring centrist politics, center-right, center-left, no socialism, no I don't know what you want to call it, not really fascism, but let's say authoritarianism on the right. But that was kind of what characterized American politics, and the two-party system here served as a kind of bulwark against those forces, et cetera. And I do think you could argue that 2016 shows the possibility of a breakdown of that meaning of American exceptionalism. Trump and Sanders each got about 45% of the vote in their respective primaries. So 60 million, about half the general election electorate voted in the primaries, so it's not a small number. Half of that, a quarter of that electorate, but almost the exact same number in both parties. So to round it off a little bit, a quarter of that electorate voted for Sanders, a quarter of that electorate voted for Clinton, a quarter of that electorate voted for Trump, and a quarter of that electorate voted for all the other Republicans. So maybe that's where America is now, sort of a quarter voting for socialist, a quarter for an authoritarian, a quarter for normal Republicans, and a quarter for an establishment Democrat. What does that suggest about the future of the party system? Do the parties continue to be, a coalition on the left side of Clintonians and Sandinistas, and on the right, a coalition of Paul Ryan supporters and Trump supporters? Don't Paul Ryan supporters often have more in common with Clinton supporters than they do with the Trump people? And maybe that's even true for the Clinton supporters with the Paul Ryan supporters as opposed to the Sanders voters. Sanders is a little more complicated phenomenon, maybe because maybe that youth vote was just, youthful rebellion. It doesn't mean they really believe in socialism and all that, but anyway, they did vote for him. Some of the Trump vote also is just a protest vote. But it does raise sort of deeper questions, I think, about the future of both parties, the future of American exceptionalism, and such. I also think Trump's success, key to his success was being a celebrity. Fuad Ajami, the late Fuad Ajami, wrote a terrific piece in 2008 about how the key to Obama's success was his kind of celebrity, very different from Trump's, and the kind of cult of personality around him, and Bill alluded to a version of this, the hope and change that Trump is in some odd way a continuation and flip side of that. And you could say that both, in a very somewhat uncharacteristically for America, we now have a much more celebrity-focused politics at the presidential level. We always had it, of course, to a considerable degree. How could you not in a big modern democracy? How could you not anywhere, I suppose, in any old democracy or in a non-democratic regime? But the celebrities usually ran for governor, and maybe they won a term or two. Schwarzenegger, Ventura, they went for Senate. They could become senators. But presidential nominees, if you go back and think about it, tended to be fairly people, they'd been in elective office. If they were, quote, a celebrity, it was by being Dwight D. Eisenhower, not by being either a first-term senator who was very eloquent or a businessman who'd never held elective office, right? So, that is, I think, also a slightly third-worldish turn in American politics. And again, it needn't be terrible, and maybe we'll get excellent celebrities to represent ourselves at different levels, and maybe it's better than the hacks produced by parties. One always has to be careful of nostalgia here. It's not like the party system produced wonderful statesmen all the time, and so, there's a trade-off, but it is a change, it seems to me, analytically, in American politics. So that's kind of the third world question about this election for me, and the question about American exceptionalism. Fifth point, and I'll go quickly through the last three because they're shorter. Going forward, I do think do we have a liberal party and a conservative party in American politics now, or do we have a progressive party and a populist party? And those are pretty different, I would say. If we have a real populist, nationalist populist party a la Trump, and if we then have a real progressive, sort of capital P progressive party instead of a center-left, mixed Clintonian liberal democratic party, which I think is mostly what we've had on the liberal side, then you have a very different kind of politics. I think a less less one I like less. It does raise the question of what the centrist Democrats and the old-fashioned Republicans do. It doesn't mean they're powerless. In some ways, being the centrist swing group between the progressives and the populists could give centrists a lot of power. I don't know if it gives them more power if they unite across parties or conceivably become a third party or an independent group. But I've generally been dismissive in the past, and I've generally been right to have been dismissive in the past, as it turned out, of all these attempts to have centrist parties, no labels, to break up the duopoly of the two-party system, et cetera, et cetera. I would say I'm much less skeptical today, both about the desirability of that, but also about the likelihood of such a thing emerging. I think, and also just if you look at the parties, they're just not as strong as they once were in terms of their hold on the public. They're more independent than ever. And legally, they're weaker than they used to be. I was slightly involved in looking for an independent candidate for a few months there, and once Trump was going to be the nominee, and we were late and we didn't work out, and there were some ballot access issues because we started so late. But honestly, if you started now and planned for 2020 at the presidential level or 2018 in any state, and if you were wealthy or had access to wealth or had celebrity or had some other form of being able to generate enough either manpower and or dollars to do a few things, you could get on the ballot anywhere. You could mobilize get your message out to a lot of people. Social media matters here too. So all the traditional party advantages, and again, I defer to the political scientists who study this stuff, but the classic kind of why you need parties in a modern democracy, I'm a little less certain about that than I was before. And I think Trump already shows that. I mean, Trump was, to say the least, not a product of any party machine anywhere, not well liked by it, and just went totally around and beat the Republican Party, and then beat the Democratic Party. So that's a pretty impressive accomplishment, I guess, for a guy I don't much like or admire. One has to give the devil his due here. And I mean, he beat two dynasties, the Bushes and the Clintons, and two parties in 1 year, 1.5 years. So fairly impressive. Final 2 points, very briefly. I do think this election teaches us a little bit about the limits of political science. I mean, I actually don't. I think the polling stuff, this is like typical, of course, of Washington. My wife, Susan, made this comment about this. If you've read or watched TV or read stuff, on sort of political blogs over the last 36 hours, there was more discussion of, gee, why were the polls wrong? And isn't it embarrassing? They weren't that wrong. Isn't it embarrassing? And was this? There's more discussion of that than actually about the election or its implications for American politics. I mean, the navel-gazing character of our political and media class has never been so evident as if you turned on the TV, from about 11 p.m. Tuesday night till this morning. I think people may have finally moved on with the Obama-Trump meeting at the White House and stuff. So the polls actually were not that wrong. I mean, Nate Silver took a huge amount of grief. The New York Times poster, 538, took a huge, not used to be New York Times 538, took a huge amount of grief for saying he thought it was a 2-to-1 chance that Clinton would win. Everyone said, it's at least 10-to-1. How can you possibly? And he said, look, these states are close. And if they're off, if Trump outperforms by a point or two, Clinton underperforms by a point or two, if the pollsters are weighing the vote a little incorrectly in terms of ethnic groups, and that's a hard thing to do in polling, actually. It's not that you just call up people and write down. You have to do weight by groups, and if you just think there's going to be a 13% African-American turnout instead of an 11% African-American turnout, and if Clinton's winning, let's just say 100% of the African-American vote, to make the example easy, if you weight it wrong, you're off by 2%. And if you're off by 2%, you got the election wrong this time, because you're off by 2% in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So, it's not that the pollsters were that far off. They were off in 1 or 2 states. The national vote, she's going to win by 1.5%, and pollsters thought it was a 2 to 3% race, right? So little outweighing for the Democrats. But that's not the problem. I mean, that's not why you can't reduce politics to a science. This election really does bring home, I think, even more than others, the contingent nature of history and of politics, maybe of life, if you want to be grandiose. I mean, a million things could have happened, and we would be having a totally different discussion here. And for all the deep things and the college-educated and working-class angst and this and this and this, I mean, Trump might not have run, right? He's walked up to the starting line before. If Trump hadn't run, I don't for a minute believe that a generic Trumpite candidate, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, Ron Paul type candidate would have won necessarily. He needed the celebrity, he needed the skill, he needed the media fawning on him, at least for during the primaries and all that. He needed some luck, he needed to win some winner-take-all primaries, thanks to the rules. All these things were totally, and if Trump hadn't run, we probably would have had a Rubio Walker ticket or something, and we'd all be up here talking about how, gee, the Republican Party is now the party of younger candidates. And isn't that interesting that the Republicans finally nominated a younger candidate than Hillary Clinton, and the younger candidate always wins, and whatever generalizations would now be making. So, I mean, Trump might not have run. He might not have won. Here's a tiny contingent thing that just occurred to me because I got a phone call. This is like in the category of ridiculous phone calls from reporters this morning saying, okay, now we're working on the transition, and we're writing articles about the transition, and you were Dan Quayle's chief of staff, so what's the vice presidential transition like? It's like, really? That's worth a whole article? I mean, it's really unimportant. That's what it's like, But anyway, but it made me think for 5 seconds about the vice presidential candidates this time. And they were not important in the race. I think we can say this was very much like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the focus of 99.6% of the attention, and Pence and Kaine, strolled across the stage for their debate and then disappeared again. But I would say, given how narrow the race was, that probably, if a different vice presidential picks in each case could have turned the election. I think Pence was didn't like the way he behaved once Trump picked him, but nonetheless, Pence was a very smart pick. I don't think that white evangelical Christian vote is at 81% without the reassurance of Pence being VP. I don't think the Supreme Court issue, Trump just saying it wouldn't have reassured people as much as the notion that Pence was going to be there to make sure that at least on judicial appointments, the top issue for a lot of social conservatives, he would do the right thing. And more generally, I think if you were a sort of establishment-ish conservative who was really worried and nervous about Trump, you thought, okay, you know what, he's going to be a problem and a headache, but at least Pence will be there, and you can talk to him if you're a congressman or if you're a voter, he's a regular, he's been a Congress, he's been a governor, he won't be totally, it's not like Trump picking a mini-me or something like that. So the Pence pick turned out to be very effective for Trump. It didn't get him to 51% of the electorate, it didn't win over any independents, but I think the reason the Republican vote came home as much as it did was due to a lot of things, but one little thing was Pence. But a little thing matters if you're going to win the election by, 1% in three key states, well, 2 key states and 3% in Wisconsin. Kaine, conversely, whom I know and like, he's the governor of my state, and I think he's a very decent guy, was a bad pick for Clinton, I would say in retrospect. He didn't get her anything, right? He didn't win her North Carolina, the neighboring state. She didn't do any better in the Catholic vote because she picked Kaine. And probably, honestly, if she had made a more shameless, and this was like a case where she actually probably picked the person, she probably made a safe pick because she thought she was going to win, but she actually picked someone she liked and respected and thought could become president if something happened. That was probably a mistake, If she had made just a pandering pick to an African American or a Hispanic, she probably could have ginned up turnout enough to conceivably flip either Florida or conceivably Pennsylvania or Michigan, I should think. Who knows? I'm not. Or maybe a younger, more Sanders-associated pick, who would have turned out young voters. She didn't do as well as Obama among young voters, and I haven't seen this number, but I think the number of 18 to 29-year-olds or 18 to 35-year-olds as a percentage of the electorate went down this time too, right? No? They don't? Yeah.
Well, based on a sort of a flash report of a longer report that's going to be issued in a couple of weeks, but I think it's about the same.
But her percentage went down some, so she...
That's the real
so she didn't...
point.
Nah. Anyway, who knows? I'm just saying, even something, when you're this close to an election, it is a good reminder of the point of how contingent things are, that a VP pick, which no one paid attention to at the time, or since really, may well have made enough of a difference. Again, you're not talking about much, right? In Michigan, tiny margin, a lot of social conservatives in Western Michigan, and Pence did well with them. I mean, I guess they carried almost all the states neighboring Pence's state of Indiana, and he has a certain ability, I think, to reach out to some of those voters in Michigan, and even in Wisconsin and Ohio, which turned out not to be close at all. So I think the case for contingency was certainly made in this election. Now, the fact that something is contingent doesn't mean it's not important. I was in a discussion. I made the version of this argument 2 weeks ago, and my friend Yuval Levin's, I said it's not inevitable. Trump was not inevitable that he would run, that he would be the nominee, that he would be this close to winning. We didn't know what would happen at that point. And Yuval correctly said, well, the fact that he wasn't inevitable doesn't mean that the consequences of Trump aren't very important, right? So that's a useful thing to keep in mind. The fact that things are contingent doesn't mean that once it happens, it can't have massive implications and consequences. So I do think Trump may have that, but I don't, and of course you have to have a certain environment and certain things going on, as Bill has detailed, with working class wages and so forth, to make it possible for Trump to do what he's done. But still, the personal, the accidental, the effect of individual decisions is important. Comey, obviously, with the FBI, you could argue also. I mean, so hero of the left, hero of the right, hero of the left. He went back and forth so many times in the last year and a half. I can't even keep track, but probably did hurt Secretary Clinton. A final point. I'll cheer now. Let me try to cheer everyone up. Bill and I began this in '92 with the election of right after Bill Clinton had been elected. He was the first baby boomer president. We've had only baby boomer presidents since, and the baby boomers being, and I'm one, being really a horrible generation, I've got to say, couldn't just leave the stage after 3 8-year terms. You think that would have been enough? Maybe Clinton, Bush, Obama, very nice. You got 24 years in the presidency, make way. No, they have to produce 2 aging baby boomers this time. All this talk about youth and isn't that we're such a forward-looking society and hip, iPhones, blah, blah, blah. We ended up with a 68-year-old and a 70-year-old running. Kind of horrible last revenge of the baby boomers. Nominees of 2 parties, which actually, certainly on the Republican side and probably on the Democratic side, if you look a little deeper, have a lot of extremely impressive 30 and 40 and 50-year-old senators and governors and congressmen and others sort of running around, And so we ended up with I take it, will be the final baby boomer election, though I guess if Trump is president and will be president and were to run for re-election, we'd have one more on the Republican side. So I think that the good news is at some point, everyone criticizes and makes fun of the millennials, but I've got to say, as a baby boomer, I would be happy if the baby boomers got out of the way and yielded to the millennials. I don't know that Trump will do that willingly or yielded even to the generations in between, obviously. But it is kind of amazing. If you had predicted, think of that, after Obama, after the big turnover in the Republican Party in 2010 and 2014, after Romney was regarded as a failed candidate, sort of the last of that generation, presumably, after Ryan becomes Speaker of the House, the youngest Speaker of the House, I think, in maybe ever, or certainly in a long, long time. And you sort of think, okay, finally, we're going to, on the Republican side, we're finally going to get to youth. Democrats already had made the move to youth with Clinton and Obama. Gore, Kerry was really the slight outlier, and even he wasn't that old when he ran, obviously. If you had predicted in 2016 an election between a 68-year-old and a 70-year-old, I think people would have thought you were crazy, but this is one of many, many ways in which this election did not go according to script, and I don't think the Trump presidency will go according to any script either. Thanks.
There's no script.
So I'd like the organizers of this panel, Harvey, Anna, Andy, others, I'd like to thank you for having me here. I'm extremely humbled. I know that's what every failed candidate and successful candidate is supposed to say now, but I don't speak to you as a candidate, but just as a kind of amateur after the spectacular display of insight and erudition and just, at the fingertips information about the election. I'm sure that almost anyone, perhaps anyone in this audience, could be up here making equally insightful comments about what's happened. And I trust I'll be forgiven for tearing up my prepared remarks on my assigned topic, the election of America's first woman president. But let me offer a few thoughts. I know you're all eager to ask questions to the other speakers, but just to take a few minutes to reflect a bit on what just happened. I didn't mean up on the stage, but I mean the election. And again, I speak less as a scholar or professor of political science. Again, unlike my highly esteemed colleagues, I'm certainly no expert on presidential politics, but as a citizen, and inspired mainly by my mother, now 100, and in full command, I'm very happy to say, of both her wits and her memory. That's a memory that stretches back to the election of 1924, 4 years after the passing of the 19th Amendment, when she accompanied her own immigrant mother to the polls to help her with reading English. Her memory is echoed by my own, clinging to her skirts in a 1952 voting booth, speaking of the baby boomers, in which my mother too, like her mother in 1924, voted for the socialist. First, this was not primarily an election directed against women or driven by misogyny, as some may rush to conclude. Many voters who derided Clinton would no doubt have happily voted for Sarah Palin or some other woman differently encumbered both politically and biographically. Nor, I suspect, was it mainly an expression of white backlash, at least not in the sense in which the left generally understands the term. The stark facts: the loss of jobs among the formerly industrial white working class, the hollowing out of small town and rural America, amply documented both by the numbers, many of which we've heard today, and by the eloquent testimony of authors like J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy and Arlie Hochschild in Strangers in Their Own Land. The declining wages across the board for the less educated, in short, a falling tide and shrinking pie for vast sectors of the country, stretching from the Vermont border all across America, both north and south, almost all the way to the Pacific coast. These, I think, speak a hard and harsh truth. The question is how to interpret that truth. Here's one try. People want respect more than they want handouts. Handouts can be a symbol of respect, a share in the spoils, as it were, that one deserves. Or they can be the opposite, a sign that one is pitiable. I think that Democrats across the board have tended to ignore this fact. As Thomas Hobbes once said, most men would rather hazard their lives than not be avenged, that is, get their respect back. What drove the Sanders folks was arguably less a desire for more free stuff than an eagerness to punish freeloading bankers and others who had robbed the young of their deserved right to rise, to coin a phrase. And Hillary's dismissal of a quarter of the population as a basket of deplorables, whom she called irredeemable, evoked a moral narrative that was particularly likely to repel a demographic group already freighted by many on the left with the burden of white privilege. White privilege is innate, for no one chooses one's white skin or one's ancestors as the original sin on which it is seemingly modeled, and from which they could never hope to fully extricate themselves, given the increasingly shrill demands of this or that self-perceived victim. According to this moral narrative, white men and women of the small towns in rural South were in a state of permanent moral disgrace, as Shelby Steele has noted. Trump's uncivil and frequently outrageous assaults against political correctness were wildly effective, I think, in their implicit promise of honorable redemption. One suspects that what Trump immediately delivered to his most fervent audiences was not the promise of more jobs, about whose details he was always somewhat evasive, or a halt on immigration, again, few details, but a first installment on restored respect. For me, the most telling fact about the Clinton campaign was its failure to include in what was otherwise, I think, a spectacularly competent and well-run convention, a single visible representative of the male white working class, as if to signal to their sort, union men and other traditional stalwarts of the Democratic Party, that they were not wanted. At the same time, the right, in my view, is in many ways equally, if not more, remiss, not only for habitually discounting the condition of the economic losers in a global free marketplace, but also for a moral narrative too eager to equate success with civic virtue or to see every problem as a nail for which free markets are the hammer. It was also a grave mistake, in my view, to dismiss growing concern with inequality as nothing more than an expression of class envy, and the more recent response to inequality by some on the right, namely pointing to data purporting to show that the wealthy are less happy, and presumably that the poor, like the happy peasants of yore, should therefore be content with their lot, was no more persuasive. I was therefore both heartened and dismayed to read today's column by Arthur Brooks, in which he speaks empathetically of a, quote, hunger for dignity on the part of many of the poor or underemployed who voted for Trump. Dignity, yes, but hunger, in my view, puts things exactly the wrong way. One does not hunger for respect. One demands, one even fights for it. To hunger for respect is already, in a sense, to merit just the opposite. A similar condescension prevailed at a Harvard election panel I attended last night with the gloomy title, Dark and Stormy. The moderator did not fail to reassuringly pronounce that we were in a safe space. An esteemed economist rolled out the woeful statistics documenting the falling incomes of those in the bottom educational tercile, especially white men, along with the rising income of those, like himself, who taught and studied at places such as Harvard. He then guiltily confessed, "They trusted us and we failed them." But his answer, fuller use of various routine tools from the progressive economist toolkit, from earned income credits to job retraining to charter schools, did not inspire great confidence. There was also a whiff of, I thought, I, the great white hope, must do a better job next time I descend among the natives. My first thought on Trump's election, and I voted for Hillary, was maybe things aren't so bad. Perhaps he is indeed a canny businessman who will appoint decent people to the cabinet and negotiate shrewdly with the Congress on the sort of infrastructure projects that might indeed supply millions of Americans with challenging work while also performing considerable service to their country. First indications, however, are not reassuring. The best news I can take away from the election on day 2 is the faint possibility of a new moral and political consensus, one that the country has, in my view, desperately needed for a long time. Every political order, as I learned from Harvey a long, long time ago, is guided by a ruling conception of justice. Such conceptions are always fractious at best, and at worst prone to civil war and dissolution. If Lincoln remains the best weaver of our fundamental national narrative, it is one that has in recent years threatened to come undone. Lincoln once spoke of a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That image was arguably hijacked following the failure of Reconstruction, a time in which birth of a nation literally came to refer, as in the highly popular if controversial film that bore that name and was itself based on an equally popular novel called The Klansman, the birth of a nation literally referred to the newly arisen union of the Aryan South and North out of the cinders of civil war. It took the civil rights movements of the 1960s to return us to Lincoln's original vision, from which we once again threatened to stray, both on the left and more recently, and perhaps dangerously, a newly emboldened so-called alt-right. For Lincoln, the phrase free labor was not an end in itself, but a means to a life of broadly shared dignity and honor. But Lincoln also knew better than anyone the limits of spontaneous order and the crucial importance of governmental power, shrewdly and imaginatively deployed for securing the nation whose image he so powerfully evoked at Gettysburg. Tocqueville, in other words, may be less helpful at this point than Lincoln, and if I may dare to say so, Kant and Hegel. A lesser consolation prize, and this refers, I think, something that Bill Kristol said, and I can only endorse fervently. The hope that my own discipline of political science might awaken from its slumbering enthrallment to the charms of statistics and formal modeling. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, and I think we've seen some really, excellent examples of data and statistics, well deployed just a few minutes ago. Helmut Norpoth's primary model predicted Trump's victory as early as last March, and Alan Lichtman's rather different version, co-authored by an expert in predicting earthquakes, called it in September. Anyway, what I take away is at least a hope that my discipline might awaken to a subtler and more truthful understanding of politics, an understanding that I think has already been in very rich display in the remarks of my esteemed colleagues, who today, as in seasons past, in their mortuary ruminations, are grave, but have been grave perhaps at times, but never dull. So with that, I eagerly await your questions of these fine gentlemen, and hopefully we can go forward together.
Oh, thanks very much. Have we got a question? Is there a supporter of Trump here?
Good.
Yes.
So I hear a lot of I don't want to use the word allies when it comes to like white liberals, but like I hear a lot of people saying, well, how much could have Clinton have done to get more of support from like working class black people, and I keep seeing back like in history, like you have Abraham Lincoln when he wanted to get the Union, how he used the black folks, in the amendment where slavery wasn't even done, and then you have Kennedy did the same thing, and then you have with Clinton and Sanders where he just caved into everything. So I'm just kind of wondering like where where you guys think where Clinton could have done to like allied or work with like I don't see like white liberals as ally. I don't know. I guess I don't know how I'm asking it, but it seems like there's always like a backhandedness where liberals say they've been allies with poor people, black people, where they're just using that as politics more than anything else. I don't know if that played to her losing.
I mean, I was like,
Well, I actually think that the relationship of the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign, both to white working class voters and to African American voters, is a very complicated question. The conventional wisdom to which I subscribe is that there are sort of threshold issues for different groups in the population. A threshold that you have to clear before you get a hearing for any of your affirmative proposals. And when it comes to the African American community, I think that that threshold is the right to vote, which was won with struggle in blood. And if the party you're representing is seen as trying to trammel, to limit the access to the ballot box in any way, then you're going to have a hard time getting a hearing for anything else. And, it is true that the African American vote overall declined, although not in all of the key states. Donald Trump didn't expand his party's market share of the African American community. There's just no evidence of that. And when it comes to groups like, let's say, Latinos, for at least 2/3 of Latinos, not all of them, but about at least 2/3, immigration functions as a similar kind of threshold issue. When it comes to white working class voters, there is a complex history, of interaction between the Democratic Party's commitment, now going back half a century, to try to break some of the shackles that had inhibited African Americans, both politically and economically. Many members of the white working class interpreted those moves, some of which were absolutely necessary and well-advised. Others, like busing, were just the reverse, and the city of Boston, I think, is eloquent testimony to that. The controversies in the 1970s were profoundly destructive to the fabric of the city. There has been a tendency in the white working class to interpret the various commitments that Democrats have made to minority groups as directed against them, as being hostile to their interests, which in some respects they were, and in some respects they still are. And so squaring that circle is extraordinarily difficult. I would be very surprised if members of the white working class were to give a majority to the candidate of the Democratic Party in my lifetime, and my expectation of which is,
Shrinking.
Shrinking. Thank you, Bill. Good verb. Analytically, I would say, to answer a question like the one you questioned, you have to focus on the threshold issues for different parts of the population and the clashes between or among those threshold issues. I don't think, the great political narrative of the past half century has been the movement of the white working class from the base of the New Deal Democratic Party to the base of the Republican Party. That movement in its political consequences dwarfs all the other movements that we could spend hours talking about. And that has had consequences not just for the coalitions of the two political parties, but for their orientations on issues. If I may be so bold, the Republican Party acquired the white working class voter at a low price, an appeal to traditional values and foreign policy strength. There was never an effort to integrate the economic concerns of the white working class into the agenda of the Republican Party. Well, that bill has come due, and guess what? It's a balloon payment.
Well, I mean, let me make a brief comment, which I think picks up nicely on that, picks up on the spirit of the question, which is, to summarize my point, and then I'll make it, maybe Trump will weirdly be the Republican who makes that payment or could change that what has been a very deep resistance among certainly, especially African Americans, but also Latino voters now, especially after the immigration fights, and minorities generally. The Asian vote is terrible for Republicans, and for reasons that are less obvious, I guess one might say, than given the history with African Americans and for that matter with Latinos. So. It would be ironic if Trump, who has toyed with the so-called alt-right, toyed with a really fairly nasty kind of nativism, and I would say on the edge of certainly a racial prejudice and ethnic prejudice, maybe more than the edge at times. It would be ironic if his presidency changed it, but he is so untraditional and so unmoored in some ways from traditional republicanism that maybe it could happen. I mean, the way I would put it is, I think the more likely thing is that it won't happen. The more likely thing is that this election is a terrible dead end or what's the word I'm looking for, a cul-de-sac for Republicans, where they've sort of managed to squeak out a victory with by getting the white working class vote up as high as it could possibly get against a not very attractive candidate, and they're going to lose the popular vote anyway by a couple of million votes, but they'll squeak through with these very narrow margins in key states and some luck, and they'll think this is the formula for the future. And as Bill said, and I think you went through some of these numbers, this is a shrinking number. They're depending on more and more, higher and higher percentage of a shrinking number. 70% of the electorate this time, I think, was white, 30% non-white. That's down, goes down about 2% every cycle. And, just how much more can you get out of this kind of diminishing number or percentage? Still a majority. One way of thinking about this election is this is the first election in which the white working class decided, okay, if we're going to have identity politics, we'll be an interest group too, or we'll be an identity group too, and we'll vote like other groups do, which is overwhelmingly for one party or the other. African Americans vote overwhelmingly, postgraduate sociologists vote overwhelmingly for one party or the other, fashionable lawyers vote overwhelmingly for one party or the other. Latinos increasingly, unfortunately, from a Republican point of view, vote overwhelmingly. So fine, the whites sort of decide we'll do it too. And there's still a lot of them. So if you get, what is it, like 35% of the electorate or something, the white working class, just about, right? Yeah. So a little less. So if you get like a huge percentage of that, that's a very big chunk to start with. But it is a diminishing number. And so if the Republican lesson from this is the path to victory, it is a riskier, and it was barely made it this year, less and less likely to make it in the future. And that will be what that's what the sort of alt-right, I would say, theorists will think. But I don't know, Trump is so different, from his intellectual defenders, presumably, that he might have the instinct, and this gets in a way more what Susan was talking about, that, well, if he could decide to get on Bill, he could decide to abandon typical Republican views, even if they were held for good reasons, not for racially bigoted reasons, about voter ID or about all kinds of quotas, affirmative action, racial preferences. Trump, there are real reasons why constitutional limited government Republicans held some of these views. Since Trump doesn't care about any of that, he might just not pick fights on that. And you could end up with Trump not sort of poking, you might say, minority groups in the eye in the way that Republicans, I think mostly inadvertently, to be fair, because I don't think John McCain or Mitt Romney or George W. Bush or Bob Dole or Ronald Reagan are bigoted people, and I don't think most of the Republican senators and congressmen and governors are. Nonetheless, he might not pick the fights that make it harder for Republicans to win over minority voters. And he might sort of weirdly do what Susan was talking about, which is appeal to their dignity and their desire not to be better kept wards of the state, thanks to the Democrats, as opposed to the Republicans, who would be more cheapskates as wards of the state. And if Trump gets a little lucky with the business cycle and some economic growth in some parts of the country, one could imagine, and if he sort of thinks this through the way I've just said it, one could imagine Trump not becoming the last president Republican to win with this very narrow majority, thanks to the white working class, but a new kind of Republican who breaks the barriers to the growing non-white vote. That would be a very best case scenario from a political point of view. It would require Trump to sound very different than he has sounded in the campaign. But as I say, since he doesn't have a huge history of investment in any of these particular issues, you'd have to really think through what policy agenda he could have that would be acceptable enough to keep the Republicans on board without picking the fights that other Republicans have picked that antagonize non-white voters. But he might be clever enough or lucky enough to pull that off. So that would be one of several ways in which one could imagine a very different outcome from a Trump presidency, and I think maybe that's what, in a way, what your question was hinting at, or at least provoked me to think about. On Susan's point that the Democratic Convention didn't feature a white working class male, it's a very interesting point. They would, I would think, answer, hey, Bill Clinton gave kind of a major speech, and Bill Clinton in 1992 was the nominee who encapsulated that. He was not Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. He was not from Minnesota. Not that those people were so wealthy or anything when they grew up, but he was the sort of, middle class guy from Hope and all that. It is interesting that he personally, in the Clinton brand, to use a word that's in fashion, has changed so much over a couple of decades that one had none of that resonance when he spoke. Tim Kaine, I think, to be fair, I don't recall exactly what his conditions were growing up, but he's sort of a middle-class guy from the Midwest, I think. Was it Kansas or something like that? He moved to Virginia when he married his wife, who's the daughter of a former governor, so I don't know if you get credit then for still being kind of a hard-working, working-class guy. But he is actually a pretty middle-class guy. But you're right. The way in which they presented themselves, I would say that to Susan, whatever the technicalities of their biography, was not to speak on behalf of those of the voters that J.D. Vance describes, for example, in his book.
Another question. Yes. Go on, come on. It's over there.
So, watching late night television, the commentary on Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the blue wall, and the white working class vote that the Trump campaign were supposedly skillfully contending for. That's kind of what I want to ask about. I want to make an observation, which is, when talking about that vote, they're white, but the white professional college women who were supporting Hillary aren't white. So the working class are coded white, but the constituency of the Democratic Party aren't coded that way, and I'm kind of interested in that, curious about that. But getting back to the blue wall, how much did the Trump campaign understand, because there was some talk about that by one of the leaders of the campaign. How much did they really understand that that's what they were doing? How much was that really part of their strategy? First of all. Second of all, is Trump in fact a false prophet? Was this all disingenuous rhetoric, or is there something there that in fact is a genuine commitment that he will or will not be able to address? And then the last bit of it is, if this is true, where would the Democrats, Bernie Sanders is saying today, they failed, the Democratic Party has failed the working class. Why were the Democrats not able to see this, the institutional Democratic Party, and address it in some way? Were they constrained by their relationship with Wall Street and Goldman Sachs, or maybe they could have tried harder to con those voters the way Trump supposedly has?
Well, maybe I could just take the first two quickly and then let you do more on the Democrats, which he probably is a false prophet, in my opinion. Most prophets are, so I'll dispose of that one quickly. On the not to offend anyone here. Not to offend anyone here who's following particular prophets. I don't want to.
I think the question is whether he's unarmed or packing.
Yeah, well, that is.
We shall see.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Look, on the first point, they did understand that was his appeal. I think he understood that, and his team understood it. But they didn't have that much of a professional campaign. So how clever the targeting was, or how precise, or look, to their credit, they went to Michigan there at the end, right? Everyone thought that, well, how ridiculous is that? He's just flailing about, and he seems to have had a sense. They had enough decent polling to see that the state was in play, a state that Republicans haven't carried in, 24 years, since 88, I guess, is that right? I went to Wisconsin. They did a fair amount of effort in a state they hadn't carried since 84, Republicans. So he sort of saw something. Now, I would say this, though. This has been totally underreported, though John McCormick wrote about it this afternoon on the Weekly Standard website. One thing they benefited from, this is again a kind of flukiness, contingencies of history. Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, who was supposed to lose, incidentally, to Feingold, and won by what, 6 or 7 points? 6 points, unbelievable. They had an extremely sophisticated operation, and actually some of the Republican interest groups, the Club for Growth and others, had a very sophisticated targeting operation in Wisconsin. Scott Walker had had this operation when he had won 3 elections in 4 years because of the recall. So Wisconsin is a state with it's a slightly liberal tilting state, Democratic tilting state at the presidential level, but it's got an extremely sophisticated Republican operation at the state level. They were turning out voters for Ron Johnson. He won by 6 points. Trump won the state by 3, I think. So Trump benefited from a guy who has nothing in common with Trump, Ron Johnson, who's he's a businessman, a very normal, so to speak, Republican senator. But, once they were at the polls voting for Johnson, they didn't desert. Only 3% of them, presumably, if there's deserted for Hillary Clinton. And Trump benefited from that. Pennsylvania. Pat Toomey, one of the most competitive Senate races in the country. He had been head of the Club for Growth, actually, as a private citizen after he lost his race in, I think, 2004, his Senate race then. They put a huge amount of effort into Pennsylvania. And so I think at the end of the day, Toomey, I think, won by about 1.3%, and Trump won the state by about a point. So again, Toomey ran ahead of Trump a little. So Trump, for all of his derision and dislike of the establishment Republicans and the incumbent Republicans, Toomey didn't even support Trump. He said at 6:45 p.m. election night when he finally voted that he had voted for Trump. Johnson was a little more forward-looking, but Wisconsin was not, of course, a strong Trump state, and Paul Ryan was from Wisconsin, and he had lost in the primary. Trump benefited a lot from very sophisticated Republican get-out-the-vote efforts in those 2 states. I'm thinking in New Hampshire probably, and there are people here from New Hampshire, that the gubernatorial and Senate campaigns were more sophisticated than the Trump campaign, and they ended up doing better actually, right? Sununu won. I think Kelly Ayotte was a little closer to her, to the governor, than Trump was to Clinton, though it was very close in both races. So he benefited from these strong Senate races. It is interesting how many of these Senate candidates, Republican Senate candidates, ran either slightly ahead of Trump or a bit ahead of Trump. I think the only race you could say Trump really dragged the Republican candidate over the line was probably Missouri, where Trump won huge, and a vulnerable Republican incumbent won. North Carolina, I think at the end of the day, Burr won by maybe about the same margin as Trump. So Trump benefited from a pretty sophisticated Republican targeting operation. But look, that's also true when you look at the numbers, that his vote skews more working class and more rural than a typical Republican vote. But because they were coming out to vote for Ron Johnson and Toomey, who were more typical Republicans, that's one reason let's call it the normal Republican suburban vote held up reasonably well for Trump. That's part of the story of this election. There was less defections, Bill mentioned this, by normal Republicans who were out to vote anyway, away from Trump. Maybe to another Democrat there would have been more defections. Maybe it was a mistake of the Clinton campaign. Maybe this is just our polarized partisan politics. Maybe Trump had made himself acceptable. For whatever reason, Clinton couldn't peel off an extra 2 or 3% of the Toomey voters and the Ron Johnson voters that he needed. That she needed to win. Final point just on race. I think this is about right. I think on whites, and a majority of Clinton's vote was white voters, I believe. Pretty 55-45, I think, if you do the kind of math roughly. And I think about 90% of Trump's vote, at least probably, is white voters. So it's not as if there are no whites voting for Democratic candidate here, It's just Trump does much better among especially working class whites.
Well, 2 points. Number one, I just finished writing an article entitled "What Happened in Pennsylvania," and the answer is very interesting. It doesn't conform entirely to the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that the Clinton campaign neglected the Rust Belt, and as a result, the Democratic vote was way down, and that's what accounts for Trump's performance. In Pennsylvania, at any rate, that is simply not true. Hillary Clinton's margin coming out of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh was identical to Barack Obama's margin, and she actually did better in the suburban collar counties around Philadelphia than Barack Obama did 4 years ago. The real story of Pennsylvania was that Donald Trump turned out almost 300,000 more rural and small-town white Pennsylvanians than Mitt Romney did. So at least in Pennsylvania, which both parties carpet-bombed, the Trump campaign was a great mobilizer, and that is no accident. And it's almost a laboratory test of the difference between running, someone from Bain Capital and someone from Trump Tower. That didn't come out exactly the way I intended it, but to put it,
from Queens,
right? It used to be from Queens anyway. But the point is that the point is that he went straight at a constituency that Mitt Romney probably couldn't have located on a map. With regard to your deeper point, there is a reason why both political parties have failed to do anything for the industrial base of the country and jobs and communities that disproportionately depended on them now for the better part of 3 decades, and why Donald Trump has made promises about bringing jobs back that he will almost certainly not be able to fulfill. The reason is that industrial decline, at least the share of industrial jobs, as a proportion of the total American workforce, is in inexorable decline for all sorts of reasons, some of which are the same as the reasons that shrank our agricultural sector from 50% of the employment base of the country to under 2% while dramatically increasing agricultural production, and some of which have to do with the fact that when our industrial base was at its height, the United States bestrode the world like a colossus after the Second World War. And everybody else, allies and former enemies alike, every other country was flat on its back. As they recovered, you began to see increasing competition. Would we have preferred that they not recover? And then, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were hundreds of millions of new working people who entered the global economy, and with China's accession to the WTO, 1 billion. And so the United States industrial base was subjected to forces that no public policy would have been able to resist. I really believe that. And we have been wrestling with the consequences of that economically and politically for a very long time now. I just heard on NPR as I was driving in from the airport an interview with a lot of people from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And they genuinely believe that within a year or two after Mr. Trump is inaugurated, the steel mills are going to reopen. He has persuaded them of that. So here's my question, not only to you, but to everyone else. What happens when that doesn't happen? Right? If you think people were somewhat disillusioned because Obama's brand of change didn't come to pass, how are they going to feel if Trump's brand of change doesn't come to pass? Where are we going to be then?
Can I just add one? I think it's a very good question, just to compound the question, really. I think it's possible, and who knows what the world economy is going to do, but you could imagine a 18-month, say 24-month sort of sugar high for the economy, which would penetrate to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, with a big infrastructure project, with the removal of genuinely onerous regulations, especially on the energy industry, with a stimulative tax cut, just a kind of old-fashioned Keynesian, pump priming. The combination of those things, which I think is going to be basically what Trump's economic plan is. I think it's unsustainable. We have like $20 trillion in debt. There are a million reasons why people of both parties actually haven't done that over the years. It's not because people are like insensible to problems in America. It's because they think it's not ultimately good policy to combine all those things. But I can imagine, so I think Bill's question, to make it even, you could imagine sort of a first 24 months where you get a mini boom or something at least like that, especially if he avoids the protectionist stuff in any serious way. But then I very much agree. At some point, the bill comes due, and at some point, the prophecy of bringing the that we're going to have coal mines reopening and steel mills reopening in some major way becomes due. And then you really do face the question of whether it wouldn't have been better to tell the truth, which is, there are ways in which the economy can adjust and people can adjust, but they're not by staying in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, probably, and waiting for steel jobs to come back. And neither party's been very candid on that. And I guess one effect of this election, don't you think, Bill, will be that the immediate effect, at least, is that both parties will take the wrong lesson, which is they should be even less candid than they have been about the changes that need to be made to adjust to actually the true economic forces out there. You'll get a sort of Trumpite Republican Party, a Sandersite Democratic Party, and that's not, I don't think, that is not a good outcome.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your comments, which have been so fascinating and insightful. I had a question. I wondered if each of the panelists could please answer it. Whether you were a member of the Never Trump movement and or you voted for Hillary Clinton, if you received a call from the Trump administration to serve, would you?
This is kind of a question contrary to fact, I think, or contrary to likely fact. I think Bill will do a good job there. He needs one Democrat in his cabinet, right? So I think I'm for Bill Galston. I want to say that now for the record, right?
I'm actually trying to figure
Susan.
out. I'm trying to figure out which of the bills in this podium is less likely to receive such a telephone call. That is not an easy question.
So I have a few friends who are in the position of just having not supported Trump and not having spent a huge amount of time insulting him and being insulted back by him. So no, I think it depends on. I think president's very different from candidate, and obviously people it's in all of our interest that he succeeds as president, and therefore the country succeeds at least during his presidency. I'll put it more in that way, and that therefore, if people feel they can make a contribution, they I think should say yes. All other things being equal to an offer. Now, I do think it depends. It's too quick though to just say yes. You should respond to the call of the president, because it sort of depends what job you're being asked to do, and if you are a free trader and you're being asked to negotiate protectionist policies, well, then at some point, A, you won't be good at it, and B, it's not appropriate to take it. So I don't think a blanket, I'm signing on to I'm a national security guy from the Bush White House. I know a lot of those guys. I want to help the country, but I'm signing on to a pro-Putin foreign policy. That you're not obliged to do that for the sake of the country. If you think you can make a difference, if you think you can help shape the foreign policy, if you think your part of the world is not, the policies will be in accord with your general view of what should be, then I think, people should go in. So Never Trump was never vote for Trump. Never Trump was not, never hope that Trump is a successful president, never support a single initiative that Trump might offer in Congress and so forth. Yeah.
There, you opened the door.
Now let me, having delivered a joke, let me try to grapple with the moral question you're raising, because it's a very serious one, and I've had conversations with a number of senior Republican intellectuals and journalists who are really wrestling with this question, and they don't find it an easy question. But let me answer from the perspective of someone who's actually been in a White House, as Bill has as well, and that is, it is very easy to get seduced by the building. It's easy to persuade yourself that, well, you don't like this policy, but if I weren't here, it would be even worse. And so there is a kind of moral slippery slope here. And if you're sort of morally dubious at the threshold, but take a deep breath and decide to do it as a patriot or a citizen, and you find instead that you are being co-opted into a program that you don't approve of and which you can influence only to a minute degree, you should tell yourself in advance of saying yes that you are prepared to walk away, and that you're not going to tell yourself the kinds of stories that people tell themselves in order to stay as close to power as they can. It is a very serious temptation.
I told you were asking a Kantian question like that. So,
Well, maybe I should just.
Yeah,
Maybe I should.
is
I'm
there
also on
is there
the-
some office that you covet, Susan? We can.
Well, I was
Any
just
one
gonna
of
say
us
that
will
I think
recommend you.
the chances of a call going out for a con scholar are probably even less than a call to either of the bills. So
Oh, it depends
I will
on the con
pass.
scholar.
That's true.
Peter Scarry.
Yes, since J.D. Vance isn't here tonight, I guess I'll be the guy who asks the question in behalf of the white working class. And I guess this is directed mostly at the two bills, maybe one bill more than the other, but I'll let them figure that out. I think there's a strong element of economism and maybe even a whiff of triumphalism that I detected from their end of the table. It seems to me that, and Bill Galston did allude to this, I want to talk about culture and cultural change. And he cited some poll data. I'm not quite sure how he was interpreting it or what the question implied about culture. But it seems to me that if you consider the last several decades, as we have been leading up to the current situation, if you look at the women's rights revolution, abortion rights, gay rights, drugs, we passed the marijuana initiative in Massachusetts 2 days ago, legalization and recreational use. All this set of profound cultural changes that might have been going on anyway, given broader changes in education and increased standards of living in the United States. But certainly, if anybody owns those changes, it's the liberal left. And then on top of that, what's been going on over the past several decades, as Bill Galston alluded to, with demographic changes from immigration. It seems to me any negative response to any of those changes results in the usual charges of sexism and the worst charge of all, racism. I have yet to hear anybody in academic life, and this is one of the big problems with this kind of economism, focusing on the economic problems of the white working class, because it kind of pins things on the economy. It pins things on the business sector, when in fact, of course, a lot of the changes culturally that have been so problematic for so many white Americans stem from places like this, from universities, which are generators of these cultural changes, or at least claim to be generators of these cultural changes. So I would just ask generally how you respond to that, and also suggest, I think Bill Galston did this, and the numbers here are dwindling. This is a rearguard action on behalf of the white working class. And it's a kind of, that's where I guess I'm pinning the triumphalism. And would just suggest to you a couple of quick thoughts, and then I'll finish. I remember the husband of the Mexican-American lady who cleaned her house and who lived in Los Angeles. How humiliated he was one night when his wayward teenage daughter defied him on the front steps of their suburban home, and he was told by the police that he could not restrain or command that his daughter come back into the house and not stay out all night with her non-Mexican boyfriend, because she was older than 18 years old. And this very traditional immigrant Mexican man was utterly humiliated. Okay? Cultural conservatism is not simply the domain of the white working class. These issues are still very much at play. And then if we look globally, and America's situation in the world, particularly vis-a-vis the Muslim world, if there's a whiff of triumphalism here, that this is a rearguard action, it seems to me that America's situation in the world ought to suggest to us that there's something more important and fundamental here about what is eating the white working class, and it's not simply declining living standards, it's declining dignity, I think, as Susan said, at the hands of educated people who have disdain and contempt for their values and their way of life that look backwards at life. And maybe, but they're there.
Well, Your question was longer than my answer can be. But a couple of things. First of all, noting that the white working class has been and will continue to be a shrinking share of the U.S. population isn't an example of triumphalism. It's simply the statement of a demographic fact, right? And we have all sorts of minorities in this country that are much smaller than the white working class that we take very, very seriously. So it's not an argument. It's not an argument for ignoring their legitimate concerns. It's simply a statement of demographic fact with political consequences, which, the double bill over here spelled out with admirable clarity, right? It's not a winning bet for the Republican Party in the long run. Secondly, is to the charge of economism. I plead half guilty. My reading of the history of, back up a step, people are talking about the epidemic of drugs, of broken marriages, etc., throughout these hollowed out white working class communities. All of that is true. But I don't think those changes are principally the result of cultural changes, whether they originated from the university or grassroots movement or anything else. Whether you read Bob Putnam and Charles Murray, who wrote two versions of the same book, what you notice is that the cycles begin when anchor industries in smaller communities shut down and nothing replaces them. The key to dignity for exactly the people you're talking about was a job that paid a living wage. And when they could no longer find such a job and earn such a wage, various reactions were ensued, the consequences of which were pathological. I just think that's a statement of fact. If Johnstown, Pennsylvania had the economic base that it did 30 years ago, its rate of opioid addiction would be 1/10 of what it is. We're not principally talking about a cultural question. And the threat to male dignity, at the hands of, the feminist movement, if you choose to interpret that as a threat to male dignity, is, I won't say de minimis, but not pivotal, as long as you have the self-respect that comes from an honorable place in the economic order in a commercial republic. So, if that's economism, I plead guilty. I'm not saying that these cultural movements had no impact on any of this, but I really don't believe that that's where the center of action has been over the past 30 years. I just don't believe it. And I think it's time to stop beating up on university professors, of which you and I, the class to which you and I both belong, and actually start looking at the drivers of what's really going on. And it's not the women's movement.
Okay,
Well,
thanks.
can I just
We're
make
going
a comment on that? Because I
okay.
certainly want to take strong exception to the notion that we should stop beating up on university professors.
Easy for you to say.
And I think Bill is half guilty of economism. I'll just if I can make literally 1 minute. I mean, I think I'm sort of in between probably the two of you on this. I think the cultural stuff is somewhat more important and somewhat more autonomous than maybe Bill's account would have. I think that you put it very clearly and helpfully, though, with your claim about it wouldn't be 1/10 the opioid use. I'm not so sure that sexual liberation plus women's liberation plus general liberationism hasn't had more of a, so to speak, independent effect on what's happening out there, and it's had more effect. And David Brooks, Charles Murray, of others have written about this. The upper middle class push these liberationist things, then find pretty good ways to deal with them in their own lives, and the working class end up being the victims. But I will flip it back in this respect against my own interests as a Republican for all these years on Peter, and I've published Peter, and I tend to agree with a lot of what he says, which is one also can't then just say, well, the white working class, those poor victims of both cultural and economic forces. I mean, they're not simply victims. Plenty of white working class people have done fine, actually. The whole white working class in America is not living in horrible squalor, and all their kids are not on drugs, and many people continue to move up from the working class. And incidentally, what about the Hispanic working class, the Latino working class, and the black working class? Now, they get some advantages the white working class don't get, perhaps, in terms of government programs, some affirmative action, but they are under the same pressure. They don't react in the same way, so race is probably more important. And this I will say somewhat against interest, having defended, I feel like there's women who wrote very eloquently in the last few weeks of the campaign that, gee, we've defended the Republican Party for decades against the charge of sexism, and now it turns out that, guess what, all these Republican men we were defending do turn out not to care much about Donald Trump's appalling behavior. There are some really eloquent pieces written along these lines. I mean, we also, if we're going to defend the white working class, I'll just put it this way. I talked to a Republican operative yesterday, a very smart guy, very experienced guy. I said, gee, think how much better Trump would do if he just could have avoided some of the, the attack on the judge whose parents came from Mexico, who was born in Indiana, who's a perfectly respectable, moderate liberal judge, and because he was on Trump's case, and I guess it's issued some minor procedural ruling against Trump, gets attacked as a biased judge. Or what about the attack on, and some of the other racially charged things Trump did? I think how well Trump would have done if he hadn't used that kind of rhetoric. And my friend, who was a enlightened guy, but who's run a million Republican races, said, no, I think Trump did better because he used that rhetoric. So one shouldn't blink that fact, if we're just going to be honest here, that it's not obvious that there aren't elements of what I think could fairly be called prejudice or bigotry out there in the country, incidentally among all groups, and that Trump probably may have benefited. I mean, this is your Pennsylvania thing. You said Mitt Romney couldn't speak to those people. Is it that he, part of the main reason he couldn't speak to them was just he couldn't speak to them for economic and broader cultural reasons, and Trump is a guy from Queens and understood a kind of the discontent and so forth, and has a nostalgic view of America, which actually fits with their view of how America should be. I don't think most of it is racial. But I also think one reason Mitt Romney couldn't speak to them, maybe, is that he was too, I don't know, if you want to be negative, say fastidious in his rhetoric, and if you want to be nice, say civilized in his rhetoric, to say things that they would really respond to.
Okay, thanks. We're going to take a break.
I'm Shep Melnick from Boston College. I'm Susan's employee at Boston College Political Science Department. And I thought I would just start off the question by inviting the panelists to say a word about foreign policy, since that wasn't discussed at all in the first half. During the primary, there was a lot of debate about foreign policy between Clinton and Sanders and Trump versus everyone else. But that seemed to disappear from the general election, so I wondered if you could say a bit about why that issue was so absent and what the implications might be for going forward with the Trump presidency.
Let me do that. Well, I think foreign policy was the reason some of us were never Trump, the main reason. I mean, there was the personal vulgarity and the breaching of, I'd say, normal norms of civility and democratic and presidential discourse, which is a big problem. But maybe you could live with that if you thought the policies would be reasonable. The combination of really irresponsible, in my view, foreign and defense policies, potentially combined with the the character issues and the temperament issues and the sort of democratic norms issues was too much. On the other domestic policy stuff, I think there are problematic things, but there Congress has much more of a role. There's an actual government in place. The Justice Department's not going to just hop to it if Trump says indict this person or whatever. So the Senate has to confirm cabinet officials. I mean, there are many more checks, obviously, than in foreign policy. So for me, that was, I think for a certain number of people, not important in terms of voters, but in terms of, I guess, journalists and foreign policy experts and magazine editors and stuff, foreign policy played a fair role. It's interesting. So I don't know. I hope he doesn't pursue the policies he says he's going to pursue, especially the pro-Putin policies, which are either inexplicable or explicable by his either business interests or views. And generally, he has a kind of Fortress America, obviously, view of the world. Again, one can imagine a more Fortress America view than I have that is still, I'd say, within the mainstream and that would still maintain the basic liberal world order that I think Bill alluded to briefly, that's gone for 70 years. But One can also imagine versions of Fortress America that really would break apart that world order. And that's a case where I do think the rhetoric, I sort of alluded to this in domestic policy, but it's really true in foreign policy, including trade policy. I mean, the kind of everything is broken, we need to dynamite the whole place, it couldn't be worse, is just ludicrous. I mean, it's just ridiculous. People, it's not true at home, incidentally. I don't know what country people are looking back to that was so wonderful. I mean, even on, this is Peter Scary, kind of, even on the, those wonderful working class days when they worked in assembly lines, I mean, in coal mines. I'm old enough to remember there was a kind of a huge literature in the 50s and 60s, not to say the 1850s and 60s too, on how alienating this work was. It's not really great to do the same job. It was by righties, a certain type of righty, kind of agrarian righties. No, but, and in fact, coal miners died at age 52 of lung disease, and when Trump said, we're going to bring the coal mining back. Well, now, look, I mean, some of it is reasonable, and it gets to a sort of the point Susan alluded to, too. There was a kind of dignity in those jobs, perhaps, that you don't get as the, checking in people on the night shift at the Marriott, even though in some objective way that job is a perfectly good job, and it's an easier job on you, and it pays the same probably. But anyway, so that's the domestic side. But on the foreign policy side, I mean, I believe objectively, the American-led world order has been pretty good for an awful lot of people. 100 billion people coming out of poverty in Asia, in a peaceful, not all of them living in democracy, though many of them, and even the ones living under dictatorship, living better lives than they lived 30 or 40 years ago. That's not nothing, and that is due to an order that's preserved, I would say, by American guarantees of power and basically more or less free movement of capital and goods. Now, you could have targeted trade deals that would be more intelligent and bilateral deals instead of multilateral deals. I was talking with someone about this out there, but that sort of presumes that, and we've published articles like this too, there's a better version of the TPP, but I mean, do we trust government to get this right? I mean, there were good versions of tariffs in the 1929 and 30, but you overshoot a little bit, it's kind of risky. And basically, a more conservative with a little c attitude towards the world order and towards foreign policy would be healthier, I think. It's also the critique many of us had of Obama, that he was too willing to throw out various babies with the bathwater when he had indulged in his dreams of a certain kind of new world order, and now we get sort of Trumpite dreams on the other side that are more dangerous, perhaps. So I think the foreign policy situation will be dangerous. Now, there are constraints here, too. There is a foreign policy establishment. It's kind of hard to really staff your whole administration without drawing on it. He does not want to be a president who presides over, wars and, or Great Depression. You can get into it without wanting to preside over either one. And I would make an argument that, in fact, signaling that you're not going to intervene in places is exactly the way you invite war. This is traditionally how wars start, not by being necessarily by America being too belligerent, but by America seeming not to want to do something, and then dictators miscalculate and overreach, and then we end up going to war and somewhat late, and after a lot of damage has been done. So that's my fear of how a Trump presidency could play out in foreign policy. One final point, and that's obviously a much bigger discussion, and a lot will do. That's what I'd say over the transition. For me, the main thing. It's mildly interesting who will be Secretary of Commerce and Secretary of Education and all that. I mean, who will be Secretary of State? Who will be Secretary of Defense? Who will be National Security Advisor? What signals does he send? That really is going to be interesting and important. And again, what a president-elect does in foreign policy isn't trivial. I mean, it doesn't just begin on January 20th. People are obviously watching what he says and does now. On the campaign, since you mentioned it, it's an interesting question whether Hillary Clinton could have done more. I mean, she is a former Secretary of State. She knows a lot about the world. Trump's foreign policy is pretty far out from the standard Republican foreign policy or the standard Democratic foreign policy or any standard foreign policy for a long time. Maybe that was his appeal, though I think the appeal was more on the domestic stuff. So could she have done more to disqualify him on foreign policy? I think that's an interesting question. They decided, I'm sure based on extensive polling and focus groups, that the way to disqualify him is to make him really scary, and the way you make people scary is traditionally in the modern era, since, with Johnson and Goldwater and stuff, is he's going to cause a nuclear war. And so Rubio had said that thing about the nuclear codes. Wasn't that originally a Rubio thing? And Hillary Clinton picked it up, and I think most of their foreign policy ads were really focused on that. He's just a rash, temperamental guy who's going to blow the world up. I actually don't think people believe that. I mean, I don't believe it myself, incidentally. He could inadvertently get us into a situation of nuclear proliferation and the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, but he is not he likes life. He likes living, he likes life. he doesn't like war. I believe him on that. He didn't himself exactly volunteer to serve, when Bill was serving in the Marine Corps, and he is a kind of a non-interventionist at all. So the notion that he was going to, the last thing he's going to do in the Oval, he won't use force when he should use force. I would say much more likely than the opposite. And I do think it didn't connect. I think they thought it worked well. It sounded like a classic talking point with which you discredit right-wing Republicans. It worked on the Iran deal to say that those of us who thought it was a bad deal were for war, and it worked in 07, 08, obviously, against Bush and McCain. And they were very used to this line of attack that the Republicans are warmongers. It didn't really work with Trump, and especially the nuclear thing doesn't work with Trump, since he seems to have no, he never talked about, he made one or two flip comments that they tried to use against him, but I'd say it was the least effective foreign policy attack on him. Now, maybe the true foreign policy attack would have been too complex, about why his trade policies endanger a 70-year-old world order, or why not supporting your allies encourages them to go out on their own, and do you really want Japan and South Korea, wonderful democratic countries though they are, going nuclear, and then what exactly does Asia look like 5 years, 10 years from now? And, those are second and third, I guess, consequence arguments that were not made much. Maybe I missed it, but I don't think they were made much in the debates by Hillary Clinton, or generally by the Democrats in this campaign.
We've sure come a long way from bear any burden, pay any price. It's now bear no burden, pay no price, right? If alliances don't pay for themselves,
Right.
then junk them. So I am even more scared about the potential consequences in foreign policy than I am in domestic policy, for a very simple reason. Article 2 invests the chief executive with all sorts of powers as commander-in-chief and, the prime steward of American foreign policy, almost plenipotentiary powers, particularly as they've been interpreted in the late 20th and early 21st century, that no president has ever possessed, with the possible exception of FDR right in 1933, when Congress, if he'd handed them a roll of toilet paper, they would have voted it up, voted it up. But there are some specifics that really worry me. Number one, this is the first presidential candidate I can remember who's spoken approvingly of nuclear proliferation. Right? And his line of argument was very simple. If we're going to remove our defense shield from South Korea and Japan and what have you, then of course the only way they can defend themselves is to become nuclear powers. That's a good argument if you accept the premises. But there are many, many reasons not to have South Korea and Japan, and by the way, Saudi Arabia and a lot of other countries as independent nuclear powers. But the thing that scares me even more than his evident approval of nuclear proliferation is the fact that he either doesn't understand or doesn't accept Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Treaty. Article 5, let me remind you, is the all for one and one for all clause. Then an attack on any member nation of NATO will be treated as an attack on the entire alliance. Article 5 has been invoked, if memory serves, exactly once since NATO was devised in the early 1950s, and that is after 9/11 on behalf of the United States. And Trump's point, which potential Secretary of State Newt Gingrich has echoed, is, why should Americans die for Riga or Tallinn or Vilnius? Okay? And, if you start sliding down that slope, you end up allowing Vladimir Putin to work his will in Central and Eastern Europe. It leads straight to the greater Russia, at the very least a sphere of influence. Newt Gingrich, referred to Estonia as the suburbs of St. Petersburg. That must have been music to Mr. Putin's ears. This is a game for very high stakes. And the twin promises of NATO and the EU have helped to keep the peace in Europe now for longer than the peace has ever been kept in Europe since people started writing histories of Europe. Are we going to throw that all away because the sums don't work out just right? There is a certain blitheness that scares the bleep out of me.
Could I just pursue just to push it? I mean, I've been very puzzled by the whole Putin phenomenon. I'm sorry. What, as people much more informed about what's going on in Washington than I am, what is this flirtation with Putin? Is it carelessness? Is it something deeper? Is he's got golf courses in Moscow and he wants to get, I mean, what exactly is going on there? And why, and this is a kind of more domestic related question, what happened to the opposition among Polish Americans, Ukrainian Americans, Estonian Americans, and so on? When did that vote pan out against Trump, or did they go ahead and vote for Trump anyway?
I think most of them went ahead and voted for Trump anyway. I don't think that foreign policy was the go, no-go for a lot of people in this election. Look, in everything I've published, I've tried to give Trump his due, and I've never accused him of being a bunch of things that, frankly, just, in the privacy of this own room, he's probably, this room, he's probably guilty of. But I genuinely believe that in people like Putin and Erdogan and the new authoritarian Polish government, he senses kindred spirits. This is a man who, by his own words, respects strength, right? When he said that Putin was a strong leader, he could not have found a greater word, an adjective of praise to attribute to him. This is a man, I genuinely believe, who sees the world as divided into strong people and weaklings, winners and losers. He's determined to be strong and a winner, and he respects people who appear to be strong and winners. So he has no bone to pick with the Vladimir Putins of this world or the Erdogans of this world. And I think it's very significant, to be blunt, that all of those people are the ones who have been sending the most approving messages in the wake of the U.S. election. That's got to tell you something. Tells me something. I don't see the responsible leaders of Europe throwing their hats in the air. It's the bad guys.
I mean, if I could just add a word here, since, I haven't given Trump his due, so I'm entitled to now say something about President Obama and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. If Saudi Arabia goes nuclear, the two main reasons will be the Iran deal, which Hillary Clinton defends, though it wasn't her deal, she was out of government then, and the inaction in Syria, and allowing the slaughter of Sunnis and the general civil war to spill out into the entire, into Iraq. And that's, so is Obama, I totally agree with everything Bill said about Trump, but one reason Hillary Clinton probably couldn't prosecute this case terribly well is that she was part of inaction which led to, in the case of the Middle East, I think a very, very dangerous situation. And in the case of Putin, fine, Trump says terrible things. I really think they are terrible and totally irresponsible, and Gingrich too. But who exactly has insisted on inaction in the actual country that Putin has invaded, which we did have a treaty with, incidentally, when they gave up nuclear weapons, and there was bipartisan majorities to help the Ukrainians. And there's one man who said, no, I don't, he's against foreign intervention apparently everywhere, even helping them with arms. And so he's resisted helping. Half his own administration wanted to help him. I think Hillary wanted to help Ukraine, and he resisted. So Obama's foreign policy, if we end up in a terrible situation, it will be the combination of Obama and Trump.
May I prosecute this? We finally have something to, something to debate. I'm going to make 2 points. Point number one if I thought that Hillary Clinton's foreign policy were going to be the same as Barack Obama's foreign policy, I would have been a lot less enthusiastic about her candidacy. With regard to Syria, and you know this just as well as anybody, Bill, she was on the losing side of a really tough argument inside the administration. And I thought she was on the right side of if the losing side. And I wonder whether Mr. Trump accepts the distinction between being on the right side and being on the losing side. But talking about bipartisan agreement, unfortunately, there was bipartisan agreement in the Congress of the United States not to do anything in Syria.
Well, that's 2013, not 2011, A. B, there was originally Republican support before Obama started talking about pinprick strikes. We don't know what would have happened if we'd had real presidential leadership there. But I agree, there were isolationists or non-interventionists in the Republican Party as well. They didn't trust Obama, for one thing. As the commander-in-chief, I would say some of them, I don't think they were principled non-interventionists. And I agree with you on Clinton. I think she's not where Obama was, but she wasn't willing to quite say that during the campaign. So I'm making a point more about Obama's presidency and now Trump's. 12 years of Obama and Trump, in my opinion, is not great for American world leadership.
Well, I have more arrows in my quiver, but I won't fire them for now.
We've got some questions. Yes, right there.
Yeah, I have two questions. First of all, Trump is a very mean person, or at least he appeared to be. Can a mean person overnight become a nice person or a decent person? My second question is, what was the effect of the FBI leaking, 1 week before the election, leaking the fact that they were investigating Hillary? They had no evidence, right or wrong, but they leaked, and she was ahead 15 points, and she lost. I'm wondering what the effect of those leaks had on the election.
Wait, didn't the FBI
Well-
investigate Clinton like way before, and then her husband went and met with the
Attorney General, yeah, that was one was, yeah.
We'll have them dressed.
Well, I'd say on the first, the first, yeah, no, mean people don't become nice people overnight. I'm just going to give you my deep knowledge of human nature here.
Well, I'd go farther. 70-year-olds never get character transplants.
Yeah. I mean, there have been other presidents who were not nice people, and maybe being nice isn't entirely a good qualification for being president of the United States. So, that's sort of a separate issue. But I don't like Trump's character, and I don't think. But no, nothing I've said, nothing I think anyone serious has said depends on him having a transformation of character. I think it depends on him, A, taking the presidency a little more seriously or differently than campaigning for the presidency, and B, just learning more about some of these things he honestly hasn't thought presumably too much about, and overcoming some of his instincts without changing his character. On the second one, that's hard to say. If you look at the actual, leaving aside the merits of what Comey did either in July or in October, or I guess twice in October, the two different announcements, I think the evidence would suggest, she took a big lead, a biggish lead after the Access Hollywood tape came out. I think it got to about 6-7 points in the average of the public polls. It seemed to come down quite a lot the week before, beginning about 10 days after, and she held it through the debates, or the debates that were going on at the time, but she won all the debates, basically. As soon as the debates ended, the race seemed to want to revert to a closer race. That was sort of the pattern over the last 3-4 months. And she did come down a lot. The lead got halved before Comey's announcement that Friday. So that week was really a bad week. I remember at the end of the week, everyone wrote those articles. This was like an exclamation point on a bad week. I'm not sure why it was so bad a week. I kind of thought it was the Obamacare premium announcements, which, again, if you're sitting in Washington, it's like it's one story and maybe inside the paper. But actually, I did look this up a little bit online. If you were actually in Columbus, Ohio, or in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or in these places, it was huge news. It was the biggest story in the local press for not more than a day or two. And you can say, well, most people aren't on Obamacare exchanges, and there's subsidies for those who are low income. Still, the headline was a bad headline, obviously, for Obama, and in a sense for the showcase domestic achievement of his presidency. And then I do think I hadn't really focused, honestly, the WikiLeaks stuff, A, I don't like the idea that we're using leaked documents, probably leaked at the behest of a foreign enemy, and B, I didn't find there to be much surprising in them, but I know people who who thought they had more effect. I mean, they really looked like a kind of insiderism of the Clintons, and maybe that also contributed to that week. So by the end of that week, before Comey, I think if you went back, this is a discoverable fact in this day and age, and look at the Real Clear Politics average. I think pre-Comey, she's up, I don't know, 3.5 or 4, and then it goes down sort of to 2 or so, and then ticks back up a tad at the very, very end, and of course she ends up winning the popular vote by 1.5. So I'm not denying that Comey could have been worth a point or so, but I do think the other stuff, ending the debates, which ended the focus on Trump and allowed people to get back to saying, you know what, he's kind of bad, but he wasn't horrible, I guess, in the debates. He didn't disqualify himself quite, and therefore we get to vote for change. I think that was probably more important than the particular Comey thing.
Well, just one sentence. Bill's chronology is correct. I've looked at that hard. Looked at it not only through averages, but through tracking polls that use the same methodology. And the bulk of the loss of the lead that she had preceded, for whatever reason, the first Comey letter.
Do you have a view on what reason was just general
I do not.
reversion to the mean kind of thing?
I don't have a view, and I've been scratching my head about it. Frankly, your explanation is as good as any I've heard.
There weren't any new tweets or otherwise embarrassing leaks coming out of
Look,
the Trump thing.
Look, I think what Bill said before is absolutely true. Whenever the focus was on him, he lost ground.
Well,
Whenever the focus was on her, she lost ground.
They managed to take the focus off.
Yeah,
That-
They
exactly.
literally took away his
They literally took
access
away
to his
his
Twitter
access,
account.
yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I
think
actually,
that's
you know,
crucial.
I actually think this raises a very interesting question. Suppose he'd never campaigned at all. What would his winning margin have been?
Totally.
All right, I have 2 questions. The first of which is this. Do you believe that, to address a point that you made, Mr. Kristol, that there really wasn't a crisis into which Trump came into as a candidate, do you think there could have been sort of a crisis, I hate to borrow this from Jimmy Carter, of confidence in the moral, ethical, and truthful character of the political system, such that Trump's appeal isn't because he's, in at least some respects, ignorant, vulgar, and bigoted, but that he's authentically ignorant, vulgar, and bigoted? And the second question is...
Where is Lionel Trilling when we need him?
And the second, very sort of unrelated note, considering the aftermath of this election, because we've seen it's already causing quite the scandal and the division and the controversy, what would happen if Donald Trump came out with Obama tomorrow, out of some of these meetings at the White House, and they both jointly said, we're going to be pardoning Hillary Clinton from any of these investigations into the foundation of emails?
Well, that would not help confidence, I would say. And I mean, it doesn't. She's in no risk at the email thing now. Presumably that who knows? I guess new stuff could show up. But Comey has said she's not at risk from at least the federal government on that. And I mean, the Clinton Foundation stuff strikes me as unseemly, but it's very, very hard to prove the kinds of things you'd have to prove for a criminal investigation there. So I'm not really a big fan of, I mean, it might be the right, I think when Ford did it, it was probably the right thing to do for Nixon, but you take a real blow, not just personally as a president, but the system takes a blow of confidence. It does look totally like rewarding your own. And I agree if the two of them did it together, maybe it would have a certain, I just don't think it's necessary, the pardon. Maybe I'm wrong. On the first point, I'm not sure I'm not sure. Are you saying that people wanted ignorance and it's just sort of belligerence? I mean, that's possible.
What I was suggesting is that they might respect the fact that he was
authentic. That could be. I mean, I guess people say that authenticity counts for a lot. I don't know. I mean, it is kind of crazy. It's hard to figure. I mean, that's to say, it makes a lot of sense in a Great Depression that you're going to have, as I said earlier, a Huey Long on the one hand, or left-wing movements on the other. Or it makes a lot of sense in the middle of the Civil Rights Revolution, uprooting 90 years, I suppose, of practice in the South, that you're going to have a George Wallace candidacy or whatever. It makes a certain amount of sense even in 92, a little less, frankly, but after 12 years of one party in power and a deficit growing that seems to be unaddressed, that you're going to get Ross Perot. Though I'd say Perot is already slightly odder. You don't get that. That's the kind of protest you expect, not when you just won the Cold War and when you've had a pretty good run under Reagan and Bush in terms of the economy and other things. it makes sense that you get Jimmy Carter after Watergate. What was the slogan? Government.
President as good as the people.
President as good as the people, right? Or why
No,
not?
government.
Government as good as the people, and honesty and all that. That's sort of an obvious, reversal. This one's a little weirder for me just because it's, well, what exactly is it that Trump is the reaction to? I mean, maybe you're right, inauthenticity, but that's kind of a highfalutin concept for people to be reacting to. It's like, we actually had a president who, whatever his deficiencies, and I'm no defender of President Obama, actually, had a nice family and lived a dignified, was conducting himself in a dignified manner. So we're going to react against that and have this kind of incredibly vulgar philanderer who has Access Hollywood tapes. I mean, it's a cliche that you always elect the opposite of what you had.
This is ridiculous.
But this is like it's a weird way for the American people to go, I would say.
Yeah. Well, just two sentences. First of all, if Trump is the answer, what is the question?
Yeah, right.
But now here's a question that I have never seen a pollster probe, and I'd like to see it. 2/3 of the American people, for a very long time, have said that they believe the country is on the wrong track. Why do they believe that the country is on the wrong track? I have never seen a single pollster do that follow-up question, and I'd sure like to see it. I'd sure like to see a bunch of them do it, because we might learn something about ourselves if we came up with some answers to that question.
One footnote to that. So one reason I think people, sophisticated, serious, sensible people, thought Hillary probably would win is they thought, that wrong track number has been bad for so long that in a way one starts to discount it, because it's not like presidents haven't gotten reelected in a wrong track environment. In fact, we have reelected the last 3 presidents. So it's that we're not exactly been living through 25 years of throwing the bums out. Quite the contrary, right? I mean,
They've invited them back in.
Yeah, right. So that seems a little inconsistent with a high wrong track number. And in fact, then smart people started to say around, I noticed some of this in September, October, well, if you look at the question about your personal well-being, do you feel better off than you were 4 years ago? Reagan's famous question, or 8 years ago, if you want to take the whole Obama administration. People do think they're better off. I mean, actually, that number, I know the Hillary camp was very encouraged by that. So fine, there's a generic wrong track number because we're living in post-modernity or something, and everyone wants to think that everything's horrible and miserable, and it's unsophisticated to say that everything's fine. So, but in the real world of people's own financial, I don't know if it's usually asked as a financial question or some more general one, but it is, are you better off, than you were? And it wasn't great. It was like, 45% said, yes, I'm better off, 30% I'm worse off, and what would the math be? Another 30-ish, 25, 30 saying the same. But it certainly wasn't, actually, it captures reality, which is, again, what everyone thinks of Obama's recovery. It's no question that people's incomes are up from 2012 and unemployment's down, and up from 2008 and unemployment's down, or certainly from 2009. So, again, however you can make the sophisticated critiques of the recovery, but it wasn't crazy for people to say that. They were just reporting accurately their own circumstances. It doesn't get to the deeper, do you think your kids will have an opportunity kind of question. But I think the Clinton camp took comfort, given that they were, in effect, the incumbent candidate, the status quo candidate, that, people aren't as unhappy as we thought. So this is sort of the flip side of Bill's question. Why are they generically so unhappy? They're not quite that unhappy, it doesn't seem, in their personal lives. And again, they're not really behaving. There are a lot of, I'm sure social scientists have studied it, there are a lot of empirical indices of people being really, really unhappy, like rioting and, doing, we know what really unhappy societies look like. And for all the discontent and Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party, it really does not feel when you travel around America, and this is the kind of thing you can't say because then you're an elitist, you only take the Acela, you don't actually get out to Scranton, Pennsylvania. But honestly, I have been actually in places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, and you don't go around there, and some people are having a tough time, and some people are worried about the social cultural stuff, and other people are worried about their economic thing. But it doesn't quite feel like a country that's, on the verge of meltdown. So it's an interesting, the whole wrong track question is a somewhat puzzling question, I would say.
Well, just to add on to your add-on, first of all, I can tell you that the view of the world from the Vermonter and the Northeast Regional is not substantially different than the view from the Acela. But more to the point, the great mystery is the wrong track numbers haven't budged, and meanwhile, the percentage of Americans approving of Barack Obama's job performance rose by more than 10 points from the low 40s to the low 50s from the beginning of 2015 until election day. And so, they might have wanted to throw him out along with the other bums, a year and a half ago, but and it may just be because looking at him, in the context of the presidential election made him look better, but he started rising in the polls long before the general election sank to the depths that it eventually attained. So I am really, really puzzled by all of this. And so I repeat my question. What is the track that Americans don't think we're on? It's not a rhetorical question.
I'm seeing a number of hands here. Yes.
I think the most important issue that can do us all in is global climate change and preparation for that. That's hardly mentioned during the debates, and so why was not that on the top agenda?
Which debates?
Presidential.
Any of the debates. It was never asked, there was no question from the moderator about climate change.
Well, I'll give you a political answer, which is not a substantive answer, and that is that just about every survey of the priorities of the electorate put global warming at or near the bottom, right? And so your sense that it's the most important issue faced by the country and the world is not widely shared by the American people. And so here we are. By the way, that issue is one of the issues where the change of presidencies can be most consequential, because so much of what President Obama did in that area was without benefit of legislation as ordinarily understood, which means that an enormous amount of it will be reversible with the stroke of a pen. Now, the Paris Accords are a little bit more complicated, but even though there are some impediments to formal withdrawal, believe me, the Trump administration's pursuit of the goals of the Paris Accord will be considerably less than wholehearted.
Just as a follow-up on that, I work with environmental agency working on that, and the answer to that is people, the environmentalists who are really into that, or don't actually go out and vote. So that's the other problem, because they're not really even being counted in the elections.
Yes, I noticed that you asked about the question to which Trump is the answer and what the problem was and why people are dissatisfied. There were people, I would have to say, unlike probably most of you, who predicted Trump's win maybe a year in advance, including Ann Coulter and Steve Saylor and many others, and who knew that the animating question was mass immigration, in particular mass third world immigration. And I'm curious about why you missed this question that is so important, not just in the United States, but in Germany and parts of Europe with Merkel and so on. I don't know about you, Galston, but I remember, Kristol, you quite recently called people who wanted quite a mild immigration restriction reform, you called them know-nothings. And I wonder why the people who did predict that Trump or somebody like Trump would win base this on the view that mass immigration, mass third world immigration was the animating issue of our time, and why you missed that, whether it's because of your worldview in general or contempt for the white working class or other issues.
So, I mean, the data show, for whatever it's worth, I mean, I think immigration was very important to Trump in the Republican primaries. You had Bush as the early establishment candidate who was liberal on immigration. I was against the Gang of Eight bill, so I'm sort of in between on immigration personally. But Rubio, who was an author of the Gang of Eight bill, Bush, who was liberal, Kasich, who was liberal, Cruz, who had pretended to be open to the Gang of Eight bill foolishly because he was being rhetorical, and so Trump was effective on that. And so I think it helped him a lot in the Republican primaries. There's not much evidence. I mean, maybe people don't tell pollsters the truth. Polls are limited, obviously, in what they can capture. There are intensity questions as well as, intensity matters as well as sort of answering poll questions. But voters seem much more concerned, seem to think trade is the emblem of the establishment selling them out and the cause of their job loss, not immigration. I'm just telling you this. And in fact, if you think about it, it makes sense, because trade is general. So if you live in Ohio or Wisconsin or out west or in or in North Carolina, you can just think that, gee, there's this new regime apparently of global trade. There is this massive fact that everyone sees, which is an amazing importation of goods from China. I think China just dwarfs everything else, incidentally, analytically on this. And therefore, you're open to them. And the bipartisan establishment has been totally committed to all these trade deals. And here's a guy saying no. I think it had a real clarity politically. Immigration, just most people don't experience it quite as much. Steve Saylor and Ann Coulter were wrong. The majority of the American public voted for more liberal immigration policies. If we can just be empirical here, Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump. Predicting Donald Trump would win, saying he would be stronger than people thought is a reasonable thing to have said. Predicting he would win imagines you could predict margins of 13,000 votes in Michigan and 50,000 votes in Wisconsin. And since Jill Stein and Gary Johnson are liberals on immigration, about 52 or 53% of the public voted for liberal immigration policies. That doesn't mean they're liberal on immigration. It just means that immigration was a salient issue for some voters. It helped Trump. Maybe Hillary Clinton could have done a better job of explaining her position. But I think it was secondary to trade in terms of, and people do go to stores and see Chinese-made goods anywhere you live. You don't necessarily, if you live in some areas, have seen your jobs taken away. It's rather rare, actually, to see your jobs taken away by immigrants. And in the places where there has been an awful lot of immigration, it's not clear that Trump did particularly well there. Trump's margin in Texas was lower, I believe, than in other states. California, which is an awful lot of illegal immigrants. Arizona, maybe it. Didn't Clinton do better against Trump in Arizona? Didn't Sheriff Joe Arpaio lose? I'm not so convinced that this is. This is again a terrible lesson that the stupid, intellectual defenders of Trump are going to now take from this, and I hope they don't persuade Trump or other Republicans of it. If they end up really going down that cul-de-sac of thinking that, I'm not super liberal on immigration, but if they go down the cul-de-sac of demonizing, quote, third world immigration, and what exactly is that a euphemism for, incidentally? It's really a disaster.
Yeah.
And which counts what countries?
For example, do you think that Somalis fit very well in Minnesota? Do you think
we have published many articles on Somalis in Minnesota, but some of them are also refugees, and there is a tradition of taking refugees.
The United States has a good record of assimilating.
Yes, it does have an excellent record of assimilating people from the third world. In point of fact,
this is
for decades on everything.
Is that right? And the country is really suffering from illegal immigration. Is that right?
How come Japan,
what is
which is homogenous, does not have the economic problems you talk about?
Oh, which country is that?
Japan. How come?
Germany, great Japan's economy, great over the last 30 years. Really taking off there like a rocket. They're inventing new goods. Really?
The economy isn't just the GDP, Bill. It's the living standard, and the Japanese living standard has been rising.
They don't even have any kids. It's a dying society. If you want to live in Japan, you can live in a Japanese-type society. No American including Donald Trump, to his credit, thinks that America should become like Japan.
How come you've been wrong on this?
I haven't been wrong. I've been right.
What have you ever been right on in decades?
Most things.
Right.
The list is so long.
Well, I'm not sure I have a dog in this hunt.
Yeah, I think you can stay on this one.
Martha.
I wanted to ask about what passes for a public square where this election and all of this German run unfolded, namely the media. And I gather that it wasn't the topic of the discussion, the part of the discussion I had to miss. So I just wanted to, I could enumerate the changes in law, regulation, and technology that have transformed political reporting in this country, have transformed the coverage of issues that are raised in elections and the way those issues are dealt with. Never mind the tone of the discourse. Never mind, the race to the bottom in terms of trash talk reality TV, which was introduced by Mr. Trump, and Mr. Rubio tried to use it, didn't work very well for him. I guess I just wanted to know, I think a lot of people now understand what's happened and how the cable channels gave Trump somewhere between $2 and $3 billion worth of free airtime, which of course wasn't free, it was paid for by advertising, because the ratings were going up, the revenues were going up, and they loved Trump, as Les Moonves, the CEO of CBS, said, bring it on, Donald.
Right.
That whole phenomenon unique, really, it's reached a different level with this election than previously. You can see it building up in previous elections. But this time it kind of went over the top. And I want to know how important you think that is. I'm reading a facial expression that's telling me not very important. Maybe I'm not reading it right. But I think it's important, obviously, because I would raise it. But if you think it's important, or even if you think it's only a little bit important, is there any coming back from it? Is there any way, have you heard any serious discussion of how we come back from this, how we transform the media coverage of our politics? I'm not seeing the path back. And I'm afraid that it's just too profitable, and we're all too much libertarians about regulation and things like that for it to change in a positive direction. And I'm very mindful of the media and how it works in a lot of countries around the world, which is disastrous. And we're starting to bear a rather eerie resemblance to that. So I just wanted to raise that at this late hour.
Well, I think the publisher of a magazine ought to take the lead on this question, but I'll be happy to chime in too.
Yeah. Now, we're just a failing, crummy little magazine as Donald Trump. So. No, I understand. No, look, I mean, there's been a loss of. We have less influence, I would say, relative to Breitbart.com, which in turn has less influence relative to Fox, and Fox has less. The people, Brett Baer on Fox has less influence compared to probably to Sean Hannity, et cetera. And of course, then there's the internet, which is a whole different world. So, it's a big question, obviously, and I share the thought that it feels more third world in a certain sense than we're used to. Now, we shouldn't, in all these cases, just as with the assembly lines and the coal mines, we shouldn't be nostalgic about the past. There were a real price to be paid for the old, three networks type media, the dominance of the New York Times. And incidentally, those were not exactly strong guardrails, maybe, against demagoguery. Last I looked, Joe McCarthy and George Wallace and people like that flourished before the internet and before Fox News and before all this other stuff. So, I think that's an interesting question of sort of it feels different now somehow. It's a little hard to know exactly how. And I do think I guess I would say most of it is technology more than the, advertising revenues and stuff. I just think the effect of the ungatekeeping of the media, which is good, which on the whole I've been a defender of and I think is healthy for democracy in many, many ways, but the effect of that is very big. And that really can't be turned around, obviously. And I do think I have friends who, do this kind of look at this stuff as you do as a kind of professional matter, who really do think one of the we certainly haven't talked about it at all, but one of the big stories of this election is a kind of social media story. That for all that it was around in 2012, 2008, and Obama's people used big data and all that, you certainly didn't have the kind of thing you had with Trump on Twitter. Those were still traditional-looking elections. I don't think it's the end of the world necessarily to have candidates, to have Twitter and social media and Facebook and fake news sites being, stuff from fake news sites being circulated, and the numbers are amazing. They're literally, I'm not talking about controversial or, Steve Saylor or something who I know who's, not where I am, but who's reporting actual things. I'm talking about literally fake news, photoshopped photos, fake news stories on things that look like news sites on Facebook that then get 420,000, circulated to 420,000 people and go viral. And it's just fake, and it's no one really wants to be and this is where you get to the question, I don't know enough about it, of what you could do about it. Should Facebook be responsible? Should there be but no one really wants to get into the business of letting Mark Zuckerberg decide what everyone shares on Facebook. And so, you have that is, I think, a real question.
Yeah, I share Bill's belief, which I think you also share, that there is no turning back, right? It's the classic genie out of the bottle, or toothpaste out of the tube. Choose your metaphor. We can't go back. What got us here? I think it is a combination of two variables. Technological change, which lowered the barriers to entry, plus the reconceptualization of media outlets as profit centers. Back in the day, this question that CBS management was asking was not how much money is CBS Evening News making. That wasn't their question, right? And I want to argue that one of the things that's happened to not only the media, but most of American society, is the pell-mell marketization of almost everything, right? And, I wrote an entire column off that Les Moonves quote that you just alluded to, and I can tell you what preceded what you quoted. Before he said, "Bring it on, Donald," he said, "This may be bad for the United States, but it's great for CBS News." Now, in the old days, first of all, no head of CBS would ever have said that publicly. And secondly, they wouldn't have wholeheartedly endorsed it privately. The fact that he not only believed it, but he said it to a group of investors, I think is a disgraceful sign of the times.
Well, can I just say, why is there no going back?
There is no going back. There's no going back mainly because of technology.
Not going back to exactly where we were, but radio, which is a pretty old-fashioned medium, also has played, I think, a big role in this. But why not other ways of doing what we used to do with the kind of conventional regulations?
The point is that first of all, if you now have a private, what is conceived of as a medium of private communication, which technology can magnify 1,000, 100,000, 1,000,000-fold, we're going to shut down the internet? We're going to shut down Twitter? What are we going to do?
No, but you could perhaps have one channel, one outlet that people knew had a somewhat different character.
Yeah, we already have that channel, and about 5 million people pay attention to it.
Would you NPR?
Which is more listened. Now, look, NPR, the radio thing is not the problem. Whatever you think of talk radio has been declining for 10 years. If you talk to anyone in the business, it's basically in a death spiral. NPR has more listeners, actually, than almost all of talk radio. Limbaugh might have more. No one else on talk radio does. So it is the key difference between this and the last 3 or 4 elections, which certainly had Limbaugh and everyone else, is I do think the Facebook, Twitter, genuine social media. Social media is a huge thing. It's a huge development, and that is hard to see how you go back on it. And there are a lot of great things about social media, but it does have this problem. That's what you meant, right?
That is exactly what. And to put more of my cards on the table, in my lifetime, and yours, and yours, and yours, we have witnessed the collapse of all of the gatekeeping mechanisms that used to screen out not only what was unacceptable in speech, but also what was unacceptable in presidential candidates, right? In the presidential nominating system that existed prior to 1968, we wouldn't be having this meeting, right? And so this is part of a much larger phenomenon, which has been the systematic dismantling of all of the barriers that used to police our culture and our politics for better and for worse. And I will say that a lot of people who didn't like the basic political orientation of the triad, the old triad of cycles, attacked the gatekeepers on the grounds that we would have more balanced political discourse if we had fewer constraints, and here we are. We were better off before we went down this road at all, in my opinion.
You scared me with some of your foreign policy remarks. Now I'll scare you back and suggest that gatekeeping and cracking down on internet have become a fine art in China, where the internet in China that. In Russia, they're retooling the internet.
Right.
So that they can control it more closely. And that could come to the United States if we're raising specters to scare ourselves.
All right.
I would just put that one up there and let it float for a while. There are ways to walk it back, but they're very unattractive and very contrary to our principles. So
Indeed.
Yeah. Let's take one more question.
Change has been sort of the dominant theme in this election in terms of analysis, and here too. If change was in the air, if it was the zeitgeist, how do we account for the fact that almost all incumbents running for federal office were reelected? I think there were 2 senators who lost their seat. One was Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire, razor-thin margin, and she lost to a sitting governor, which is hardly emblematic of the thirst for change. So why is it that this is a change election and all the incumbents get reelected?
No, I think it's the right question, and I think we both maybe didn't alluded to this, to the answer, if there's an answer without maybe specifying it. I'll just intensify. Yeah, it's absolutely, look, that's not just true of this election, incidentally. We've had turnover at the midterm elections in 2010 and 2014, but if you came down from Mars and looked at these results, it's basically the 2012 result with a slight tilt towards Trump in the white working class voters, we've been saying endlessly, and a little bit of an underperformance by Hillary Clinton and rallying Democrats. Doesn't look wide. I mean, we've had the last 4 or 5 presidential elections, the partisan division's been not that different. The Senate, as you say, very little change. The House, very little change. And indeed, if Marco Rubio and Scott Walker or Jeb Bush or whoever you want even had won by 3 points in this election, it would be the most normal election ever. After 8 years, 2 terms, hard to sustain, hold the White House, the other party nominates someone acceptable, someone fresh, the other party wins, there's not much turnover in Congress. So, and yeah, you're right, in some ways it's a status quo, and indeed the Democrats nominated their most status quo candidate, and they ran a very conventional, campaign, not great, not horrible, and she got 1.5 million votes more than the Republicans. So Obama got 4 million votes more than Romney. She got 1.5 million votes more than the Republican candidate. So it's a big only though. The only aspect of change is the weirdness of Trump as a nominee, both in terms of who he is, never having been elected to anything, and his message, and then his defeating very narrowly Hillary Clinton in the general with a message and characteristics that one might have thought disqualified him. So I very much, this is sort of my contingency point. I mean, it might not have been this election need not have been a big inflection point. I almost think in that one would have been better off predicting that it wasn't going to, one would have been correct to predict that it wasn't going to be. And if Donald Trump had chosen to just have his nice life continue at Trump Tower and all that, which he probably was pretty close to, I don't know that he was, really planning to run in he was thinking about it for a while. I don't believe that others, there would have been some, expression of immigration sentiment, of anti-trade sentiment, maybe a little more in the trade issue than there has been in the past. But it's not like we haven't had elections with Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot and Ron Paul and Dick Gephardt. On the Democratic side, we've had anti-trade candidates before, obviously. It would have been a normal election, except somewhat for Sanders, I would say, and especially for Trump. But it's a big except. And now that he both wins the nomination and wins the election, it becomes one of those things that needn't have happened, but when it happens, it can have very big effects in terms of change, I would say.
Well, I think that Bill's explanation is a good one as far as it goes, which is pretty far actually. The one big difference is that I think a bunch of us have underestimated the concentrated force of economic change over the past 15 or 20 years. That is, the division of the country into people who've benefited modestly and people who've lost bigly. And hugely, right? And we'll all have to learn how to speak a slightly different language from here on out. And so a decisive slice of the American population felt so desperate and so angry that it genuinely came to believe that it had nothing left to lose, right? And Donald Trump rolled up the margin among that small, but as it turns out, decisively located part of the population. And here we are. I think that...
They were so disenchanted, why didn't they throw the other bums out too? While they were at the voting booth and they got the ballot in front of them, they could have X'd out all the income.
Well, they could have, but I think that Donald Trump managed to convince them. Well, let's back up and tell the story. Okay? Barack Obama comes into office. I'll just pick one issue and follow out the narrative thread. Barack Obama gets into office, and within the first year or so, we have the Affordable Care Act. Okay? Then the Tea Party rises up and says, give us control of the House of Representatives and we will repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. So the House Republicans get the majority, nothing happens. Election of 2012, Obama's reelected. Then 2014, the problem is the Senate. Give us the Senate and we will repeal the Affordable Care Act. So the Republicans were given the Senate. They didn't even try to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And finally, Donald Trump comes along and says, if you give me the power to do it, I will do it. I think that a lot of people who voted for Trump ended up believing that the Congress of the United States was a totally feckless and impotent instrument of governance, and that only the president could make the difference. And and so they went with Trump and sort of elected him.
Only I can save you.
Yeah, right.
But
Look, I mean, lots and lots of bums were thrown out in 2010. And in effect, there was a continuing revolt against the leadership of the Republican Party for 6 years.
I mean, if you want to write, so I say 2 points. I mean, one, I think you're probably right. What the implication of your question is there should be more change in 2018 and 2020 if Trump is a big deal systemically and not a one-off figure, just unique and contingent and a celebrity, and he kind of goes away and whatever, things go back to they are. So I think that would be an interesting test.
Yes.
It would be surprising not to see more stuff happen of defeating incumbents in primaries and general elections in 2018 and 2020. The other way to say it, though, is that we've had a lot of precursors. I mean, Bill was getting to this, but just if you think back even further, Obama beats Hillary Clinton in 2008. That hadn't happened in a while, a real upset in a primary. Actually, the front runners had won basically every time in both parties for quite a while. Then you get Tea Party, and they're genuine upsets, some defeats of incumbents, defeats of favorites in primaries and so forth. And that goes through 2010, and a version of it, I mean, still alive, I'd say, in 2014. And then you get Sanders. Amazingly, among white, if I'm not mistaken, but Sanders almost beats Hillary Clinton among white voters. African Americans save her because they're loyal to the Clintons and they believe in her, and she has no real relationship with them. But again, if you had predicted 2 years ago that a socialist from Vermont is going to run even among white voters around Democrats around the country with Hillary Clinton, that's pretty astounding. And then you get Trump. So in that respect, there is more of a precursor to it. I agree it doesn't show up. In 2016, people seem perfectly happy re-electing their senator in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But you would sort of expect to see, A, there have been precursors, and B, you'd expect to see consequences in 2 or 4 years, I guess.
Yeah. There is an apples and oranges issue, however. You may disagree with this, Bill, but I'm pretty confident in what I'm about to say, namely that if Hillary Clinton had not voted to authorize the war in Iraq, she would have been the Democratic nominee in 2008 and the next and the President of the United States on January 20th of 2009. So, war as a divisive issue in the Democratic Party has a very long, unhappy history.
On that note, I'd like to have you join me in thanking our guests.